She was 19 years old, standing in a diner at midnight in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, hiding bruises under sleeves 3 sizes too big. And she had no idea the man who just walked through that door had been carrying his dead brother's ghost for 8 years. Neither did he know that the crumpled sketch taped beneath her counter was the last thing his brother ever drew before someone made sure he'd never draw again. One drawing, one girl, one secret that was about to drag 17 bikers into a war they didn't start, but would absolutely finish. Stay with me tonight, all the way to the end. If this story hits you, smash that like button and drop a comment. Tell me what city you're watching from. Let's ride. The rain came down like it had a personal grudge against the state of Tennessee. Not the soft kind of rain that made people reach for blankets and turn on old movies. This was the kind that hammered asphalt like it was trying to break through to something underneath. The kind that turned highway lines into bleeding streaks of white and yellow and made 18-wheelers pull over on the shoulder with their hazards blinking like distress signals from sinking ships. The temperature had been dropping since 6 in the evening, and by midnight it sat somewhere between frozen and brutal, the kind of cold that crawled inside leather seams and settled into old scars that never quite healed right. 17 Harley-Davidson motorcycles came out of the dark like a single organism with one heartbeat. They rode tight, not recklessly, but with the kind of disciplined formation that spoke of men who'd learned coordination the hard way. The kind of coordination that got drilled into muscle memory by years of riding and years before that of something else entirely. The engines were loud enough to feel in the chest cavity, even through a diner window. Low thunder rolling ahead of itself. The Black Vulture's MC patch was visible on every leather cut. A bird with spread wings stitched in black thread on black leather, nearly invisible until headlights caught the silver outline just right, like something that only revealed itself when it wanted to be seen. At the back of the formation rode Cade Mercer. He wasn't the president, he wasn't the enforcer, or the road captain, or any title that carried ceremony. He was simply the man the others unconsciously arranged themselves around without ever discussing it out loud, the way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet without being asked. 6'1", 210 pounds of something that had been broken and refused incorrectly. Not wrong enough to fall apart, but crooked enough that you noticed if you looked too long. The scar that ran from his left temple down past his jaw was old enough to have gone silver white, standing out against weathered skin like a seam in old wood. He wore no expression worth naming. His eyes moved constantly, cataloging exits and threats and shadows with the automatic efficiency of a man who'd spent years in places where missing something got people killed. Afghanistan had given him a particular kind of awareness. It had also taken particular things in exchange, the way that place always collected its debts. He hadn't spoken more than 30 words since they left Nashville 6 hours ago. Nobody pushed him on it. The club had learned years back that Cade's silence wasn't hostility. It was just the shape he took when he was thinking hard about something he hadn't decided to share yet. The diner materialized through the rain like a stage set, a low rectangular building with a red neon open sign that buzzed and flickered in the wet air, a hand-painted sign above the door reading Mountain Ridge Diner, Judbon, 1987, a gravel lot that had about 4 vehicles in it, including a dented livestock truck. Warm light pressed against the fogged windows. The smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee reached them even through the storm. Bones, the road captain, 43 years old, missing the top half of his left ear, from a story he told differently every time someone asked, pulled in first and cut his engine. The others followed in sequence. One by one, the Harleys went quiet until the only sounds were rain and the distant complaint of wind through mountain pines and the particular kind of silence that settles after 17 engines stop at once. Cade sat on his bike for a moment after everyone else had dismounted. He looked at the diner. Nothing particular about it. Nothing his brain flagged. Just a reflex he'd never been able to quit. The pause before entering any space, the habit of reading a building's energy before walking into it. He swung his leg over and followed the others inside. The bell above the door made a thin aluminum sound that got buried immediately under the noise of wet boots and bodies filling the space. The diner had maybe 12 tables and a long counter with 8 stools, the kind of place that had been decorated once in the 80s and then just quietly left alone to age. Laminate tabletops with cigarette burns at the edges. A jukebox in the corner that was currently playing something slow and country that nobody was listening to. A mounted deer head above the coffee machine that had a Santa hat on it left over from Christmas, still up in February because nobody had bothered to take it down. The handful of existing customers went quiet. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in movies where everyone slowly turns and stares. It was subtler than that. Forks pausing midair, conversations dropping a register, eyes cutting sideways and then deliberately looking away. 17 men in wet leather cuts with a bird patch on their backs had a way of adjusting the atmosphere of a room without doing a single thing. Bones had the social navigation handled within 30 seconds, sliding onto a counter stool and addressing the older woman behind the counter with the particular warmth he kept tucked under his robe. Captain Exterior for exactly this kind of situation. "Evening, ma'am. We're just looking to get out of that weather for an hour. Coffee and whatever's hot. Pay cash, no trouble." The older woman, heavy-set, gray hair pinned back, the kind of face that had seen enough of the world to stop being impressed by most of it, looked at him for a long moment, then at the men filing into booths behind him, then back at Bones. "Coffee's on," she said. "Kitchen's still running for another hour. Don't break anything." "Yes, ma'am." The club settled in with the practiced ease of men accustomed to occupying spaces that didn't originally want them. Booths filled. Wet leather hit vinyl seating. Boots scraped against old tile. The older woman started moving cups, and the coffee machine's hiss picked up. Cade took a stool at the far end of the counter, back to the corner wall, facing the room. That was when he saw the girl. She came out of the kitchen carrying a tray of coffee cups with both hands, moving with the careful deliberation of someone trying to make themselves small and efficient simultaneously. 19, maybe 20. Brown hair pulled back in a ponytail that had been neat 6 hours ago and was winning a battle with gravity now. She was wearing a long-sleeved thermal under her uniform shirt, despite the diner being easily warm enough to not require it. Her eyes moved across the new customers with the rapid assessment of someone calculating risk without knowing they were doing it, a survival instinct that had been trained into muscle memory. She set cups down without being asked, moving table to table with her head slightly ducked, offering refills and taking orders in a voice kept low and neutral. Not unfriendly, not warm, calibrated. Cade watched her without staring. What he noticed wasn't the bruise, not right away. What he noticed first was the way she turned at the sound of a door opening in the kitchen, the way her whole body went a degree tighter, her shoulders drawn in microscopically, her chin dropping. It was the response of a body that had learned doorways could be threats. He'd seen that response in Kandahar. He'd seen it in the eyes of people who'd been living inside someone else's violence for long enough that they stopped experiencing it as events and started experiencing it as weather. Just the climate they lived in. Just the way air felt. Then she reached across his end of the counter to refill a cup 2 stools down, and her sleeve rode up 2 inches. The bruise on her forearm was 5 days old, maybe 6. Yellow-green at the edges, darker in the center, the size and shape of fingers. She pulled the sleeve down immediately, didn't look at him, kept moving. Cade picked up his coffee cup and said nothing. The diner's owner came out of the back at 12:45. He was a thick man, late 50s, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up and the kind of expression that had calcified into default authority years ago. He moved through his own establishment with the proprietary ease of someone who'd never questioned his right to take up space, stopping to exchange a few words with the other customers before his eyes landed on the cluster of bikers filling his booths. His expression didn't change. He was too practiced for that. But he moved to the counter and said something low to the older woman. Cade caught half hour and close up, but nothing else. Then his eyes skimmed along the counter stools and landed on the girl, who was refilling someone's water glass at a booth near the window. "Willa." His voice was flat, not loud. It didn't need to be. The girl, Willa, straightened immediately. "Yes, sir." Table 4's been waiting on their check for 10 minutes. "I'll get it right now." "You'll get it right now," meaning you should have gotten it right then. A beat of silence. "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation warranted. Then he went back through the kitchen door. Nobody at the counter commented. The older woman's expression didn't shift. The customers in the booths went back to their food. Cade set his coffee cup down very carefully. He'd spent enough time reading rooms to understand that what he'd just witnessed wasn't incidental. The older woman's deliberately neutral face told him she'd seen this exchange 100 times and made her peace with it because the alternative cost too much. The customer's quick return to their meals told him this was normal here, just the texture of the place, something they'd all collectively agreed to stop noticing. And Willa had responded the way she had not because she feared being corrected in front of customers, but because she feared what came after. The correction was just the overture. He was still thinking about that when he saw the sketch. It was taped to the underside of the counter with 2 pieces of masking tape, the kind of place you'd put something you wanted to keep accessible but not visible to casual observation. Willa had leaned down to retrieve a dropped spoon near his end of the counter, and in doing so, she'd pulled her stool back 2 feet. And in doing so, the angle of the overhead light had shifted just enough to illuminate the underside of the counter, just enough that Cade's eyes, which cataloged everything without his permission, landed on it. A piece of notebook paper, folded once, and then unfolded and taped flat. A motorcycle drawn in pencil. Not the rough sketch of someone doodling a generic bike. A technical drawing, detailed and specific, with measurements annotated in a handwriting Cade recognized the way you recognize a voice you haven't heard in years. The particular spacing of the letters, the way the number 7s had a crossbar through them, the slight leftward lean. His brother had been drawing like that since he was 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in their mother's house in Murfreesboro, with pencils laid out in order of hardness, filling graph paper notebooks with engine diagrams and motorcycle modifications that at the time were mostly dreams and later became something else. Cade's hand was on the counter. He was aware of his own breathing in a way he hadn't been aware of it in a long time. His brother Danny Mercer had been dead for 8 years. Killed in a garage fire the fire marshal had ruled accidental. Faulty wiring, old structure, the kind of thing that happened in the rural counties when buildings got old enough and nobody cared enough to maintain them right. The case had been open for 6 weeks and then quietly closed. Nobody in the club had pushed on it. Not because they didn't care, but because 2 of them who had pushed initially had gotten visits from county deputies shortly afterward, the kind of visits that communicated clearly without saying anything criminal. The club had buried it. They'd buried Danny, they'd buried the questions, they'd buried the grief under enough miles and enough noise to make it survivable. Cade had never stopped believing it was wrong. He'd just stopped knowing how to prove it. He lifted his eyes to Willa, who had moved back to the far end of the counter and was wiping it down with a cloth. "Hey!" His voice came out quieter than he intended, rougher. She looked at him with that same rapid risk calculation in her eyes. "That drawing," he said. He nodded toward the underside of the counter. "Under there. Where'd you get it?" The cloth in her hand stopped moving. For 2 full seconds, she was completely still, the way an animal goes still when it's deciding between flight and freeze. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You know exactly what I'm talking about." Hatcher, 28, the youngest full-patch member of the Black Vultures, who had the social awareness of a concrete block but also a very accurate read on when Cade's voice shifted registers, looked up from his booth. Willa's eyes moved briefly, taking inventory of where the other bikers were. Then back to Cade. "My dad drew it," she said. Her voice had gone flat and careful, the kind of flat that was holding something still through sheer effort. "Before they killed him." The diner went quiet the way a room goes quiet when a sound drops out that you didn't realize you were hearing. The jukebox had cycled between songs. The coffee machine had just finished its cycle. The rain against the windows suddenly seemed very loud. Cade looked at her for a long moment. "How old were you when he died?" Her jaw was set. 11. "Where did it happen?" "I'm working." "I understand that. Where did it happen?" She looked at him like she was trying to read something in his face and wasn't certain she could trust her own translation. Then she picked up the coffee pot, purely as a prop, something to hold, something that gave her a reason to be standing where she was, and said very quietly, "Bledsoe County, old repair shop outside Pikeville. They said it was a fire." Cade's hands were flat on the counter. Bledsoe County, Pikeville. 8 years ago, Danny had been running a side job at a shop in Pikeville for extra income, something he'd never told the club about because Danny had always been the one of them who kept his personal life partitioned, not from shame, but from some instinct that the things that mattered most to him deserved protection from the edges of what the club was. The shop in Pikeville had been where Danny had died. Cade became aware that Bones was watching him from 3 stools down. Bones had been with the club when Danny died. Bones remembered. And from the way Bones had gone very still in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness, Cade understood that Bones had just connected the same dots. "What was your father's name?" Cade said. Not a question. The way it came out was too controlled to be a question. Willa set the coffee pot down with a faint ceramic sound. Her hands weren't quite steady. "Vale," she said. "Jesse Vale." Cade hadn't known his brother's friend's last name. Danny had called him Jess or Wichita or any of 3 other names depending on context, the way people in their world rarely went by the name their mother gave them. But he'd known Jesse Vale, known him by a photograph on Danny's phone, known him by the way Danny had talked about him in the last year before the fire. Jess found something, Danny had said once, just once, in the kind of voice that meant he was trying to decide how much to share. Something worth money to the wrong people. Cade had asked what kind of something. Danny had said he'd explain when he knew more. He'd never gotten the chance to explain. "Your father and my brother," Cade said slowly, the words sitting heavy in his mouth, "knew each other." Willa stared at him. In the 8 years since Danny's death, Cade had developed a kind of armor around the subject. Not healthy, not healed, just operational. A scar formation over something that would never fully close. He'd gotten good at carrying it without showing it, the way soldiers got good at things they never wanted to be good at. But right now, standing in a diner in the Tennessee mountains at 1 a.m. with rain hammering the roof and a 19-year-old girl looking at him with her dead father's drawing tucked under the counter, the armor felt very thin. "I need you to tell me everything," he said. "I don't know you." Her voice had a tremor in it she was working hard to control. "No, but I think you know why I'm asking." She looked at him for another long moment, measuring something, calculating something he couldn't fully read. Then she looked away, at the kitchen door, at the older woman who had diplomatically relocated herself to the far end of the counter, at the rain outside. "I get off in an hour," she said, "and I'm not staying here to say it." She came out the back door at 2:15 in the morning. She was wearing a coat that was a size too big, and boots that had been resoled twice, and carrying a backpack with one strap repaired with duct tape. No umbrella. The rain had eased to a steady cold drizzle that hung in the air like gauze. She stopped when she saw that it wasn't just Cade waiting in the gravel lot. Bones was there too, leaning against a truck that belonged to nobody in particular, and Hatcher was sitting on the hood of his bike 30 feet away in the shadows. "I said I'd talk to you," she said. "Not all of them. They stay." Cade's voice was level. "Or we don't have a conversation." She looked at Bones, who was giving her the particular expression he reserved for civilians he was trying not to alarm. A studied neutrality that required actual effort from a man who looked the way Bones looked. "Fine," she said. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a water-damaged manila envelope that had been folded and unfolded many times along the same creases. She held it without opening it. "My dad was a mechanic," she said. "Good one. Not just regular work, custom work. People brought bikes from 3 states over because he understood the engineering of it, could look at a design and tell you what it would do before you built it." She paused. "He met your brother at a rally in Cookville. They got to talking about engine modifications. Your brother was building something, a custom frame design he'd been working on for years. Dad was the only guy he'd met who could actually understand the technical side of it." "Danny never mentioned a collaboration," Bones said. "He wouldn't have. My dad didn't talk about it either. Not because it was secret, just because it was theirs to work on." She was looking at the envelope. "They were at my dad's shop 3-4 nights a week for almost a year. Then one night Dad came home different." Cade waited. "He'd been going through some old trucking invoices. My dad did fleet maintenance on the side for a couple of the regional haulers. He found something in the paperwork that didn't make sense. Routes that didn't match loads. Weights logged that were impossible for the listed cargo. Timing that only worked if stops were being made that weren't on any official record." What kind of stops? Cade said. Her jaw worked for a second. The kind where what's being transported isn't cargo. The rain dripped off the diner's eave into a steady thin stream between them. He told your brother, she said. Shouldn't have. But he trusted him. 3 days after that, your brother died in the fire. She finally looked up from the envelope, met Cade's eyes directly for the first time. 2 weeks after that, my dad died in the same fire. Different day, different location. Same investigation officer, same ruling. Bones was no longer leaning casually against the truck. Hatcher had gotten off the bike's hood and was standing. Cade was very still. How old were you? He said. 11, like I said. Where did you go after? Aunt, then foster when the aunt couldn't afford 2 kids, then aged out at 18. The flatness in her voice was the flatness of someone who had said these facts aloud enough times that they'd stripped all the rough edges off them. Not because the grief was gone, but because the grief had somewhere else to live now, deeper down, out of reach of the voice. I've been working here since October. Mr. Garrett owns the place. He knew I needed work. Cade filed Mr. Garrett's name and everything attached to it. The envelope, he said. She held it for another moment, then extended it. Inside, 6 photographs, a USB drive, and 4 sheets of paper covered in her father's handwriting. Names, dates, invoice numbers, route codes. 2 county department letterheads that Cade didn't need to read carefully to understand their significance. He looked at the photographs. 3 men in business clothes meeting behind a warehouse Cade didn't recognize. A truck with its back doors open. The photograph was too far and too dark to confirm what was inside, but the context of the documents made it unnecessary. And one photograph that made the cold in Cade's chest go from ache to something else entirely. A county sheriff's deputy, recognizable by uniform and badge, shaking hands with a man in a suit outside a building Cade knew. He'd been to that building for a meeting 8 years ago, after Danny died. He'd spoken to the deputy. The deputy had told him the investigation was complete. He handed the envelope to Bones without a word and turned back to Willa. How long have they known where you are? She blinked. What? The people in those photographs. How long have they known where you're working? She went very still. I've been careful. Nobody stays careful forever when someone's looking. Cade looked at Hatcher. Get the bikes ready. Hey, Willa's voice cracked slightly at the edge. I didn't ask for... Your father documented a trafficking network operating through protected trucking routes. The 2 people who knew about it are dead. You're carrying the evidence. You've been working at the same diner for 4 months. Cade looked at her steadily. How long since someone in a vehicle you didn't recognize drove past here more than once? The silence that followed was its own answer. She looked away. Her throat moved. 2 weeks ago, she said quietly. Black SUV, parked across the highway for an hour and then left. Bones was already on his phone. Hatcher had moved to the bikes. The older woman appeared in the diner's back doorway, coat on, looking at them with an expression that held something complicated. Not surprise, not accusation. Something closer to the face of someone who has been waiting for a particular thing to arrive and has mixed feelings about finally seeing it. Take her, the older woman said to Cade. I've been trying to get her to leave for 3 weeks. She's too stubborn to go alone. Willa turned. Ruth, don't. Ruth's voice was firm in the way old love was sometimes firm. I know what those trucks are. I know what this town costs people who notice too much. You go with these men and you don't look back. Willa was gripping the strap of her backpack. Cade watched her make the decision, watched it happen in her face. The specific movement of a person who has spent years being failed by institutions and systems and people in authority positions and is now standing at the edge of trusting strangers. She has no rational reason to trust, knowing the alternative is staying in a place that has already been marked. I don't get a bike, she said finally. You'll ride with me, Cade said. She looked at the massive Harley, at him, at the other men moving with quiet purpose through the dark parking lot. You knew him, she said. Not a question anymore. Something had shifted in her understanding, and he could see her recalibrating around it. Your brother, you actually loved him. Yeah. She put her backpack on. Okay, she said. They rode out into the mountain dark at 2:45 in the morning, 17 bikes going north through the rain, with Willa's arms around Cade's waist and her face pressed against the back of his leather jacket and the envelope full of her father's evidence tucked inside his cut against his chest. She was shaking. He could feel it through the leather. He didn't know if it was cold or grief or relief or all of it at once. It didn't matter which. He kept the throttle steady and his eyes on the road, and the mountains closed around them like walls made of pine and dark and distance. Somewhere behind them, in a parking lot off a state route, a black SUV with no plate sat in the shadows 200 yards from the Mountain Ridge Diner. The engine was running, and the men inside were watching the empty lot where 17 motorcycles used to be. One of them picked up a phone, dialed, listened, then said 4 words into the receiver, calm and flat and without any emotion whatsoever. "She's already gone." There's a pause on the other end of that call, just 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, something shifts. The kind of shift that happens when a careful plan stops being careful, when patient men stop being patient. And 300 miles away, in a building with no signage and a parking lot full of dark vehicles, someone who has spent 8 years being very sure his mistakes were buried, hears that the girl who carries those mistakes is on the back of a motorcycle heading north through the mountains. He doesn't panic. He never panics. He simply picks up a different phone and makes a different call. And that's when this story stops being about what happened in the past and starts being about what's coming. The garage sat at the edge of Harlan Falls like something the town had tried to push out and failed. 3 stories of corrugated metal and old brick built into the side of an industrial embankment where the railroad tracks ran dead into a switchyard that hadn't seen active freight in 11 years. The building had been a machine shop once, then a storage facility, then nothing. And then the black vultures had found it the way they found most things, by accident and necessity, on a night when they needed somewhere to put themselves and everything they carried. That had been 6 years ago. Now it was the only address most of them could honestly call home, which said something about the kind of men they were, though most of them preferred not to examine what exactly it said. The sliding front door was 14 feet wide and reinforced with a steel bar that required 2 men to lift. Inside, 12 motorcycles on their stands in a row, a hydraulic lift in the center bay, workbenches along 3 walls covered in tools that had been used and cleaned and used again for years, a wood-burning stove in the corner that threw heat in a 12-foot radius, fluorescent lights overhead, 2 of them flickering on a bad ballast, a loft space above the office that served as sleeping quarters for whoever needed sleeping quarters on any given night, accessed by a ladder with a cracked 3rd rung that everyone had learned to step over. It was 3:47 in the morning when the bikes came home. Cade pulled in last, as always, and cut his engine and sat for a moment while the others filed in around him. The cold had gotten serious in the last hour. Not the damp cold of the rain, but the dry, hard cold that came after the rain moved through, the kind that made metal contract audibly and breath visible even inside the first few feet of the garage. Willa climbed off the back of his bike. She stood in the middle of the garage floor and looked at it the way a person looks at something they can't immediately categorize. The bikes, the tools, the sleeping bags visible on the loft railing above, the photographs and road maps pinned to the office wall, the wood stove already being fed by a heavy-set man named Decker who'd arrived ahead of the group and had the place at temperature before anyone walked in. She looked at Cade. "This is where you live?" "Most nights." She nodded slowly. Not judgment, just recalibration. Bones was already at the workbench with the envelope's contents spread across a clean section of metal, photographs and documents laid flat under good light. Hatcher had positioned himself near the front door, not blocking it, just near it, the way dogs position themselves near exits when they've sensed something they can't name yet. 3 other members had come in and gone straight to their own work. The practiced normality of men who understood that the best response to a volatile situation was to let it develop without adding to its volatility. Decker straightened from the stove and looked at Willa with the particular scrutiny of a man who had learned to read people the way mechanics read engines. Not cruelly, but thoroughly. "You eat?" he said. She blinked. "What?" "It's 4 in the morning. You've been working a diner shift. You're standing there like you might fall over. You eat anything?" She stopped. "Not since lunch, I think." Decker went to the corner where a camp stove sat on a folding table beside a collection of canned goods and a cast iron pan with the seasoning of years built into it. He didn't ask what she wanted, he just started making something. Willa watched him for a moment with an expression she covered quickly. The expression of someone who had been asked so rarely about basic things that the asking was briefly disorienting. Then she went to the workbench where Bones was working through her father's documents. Bones had been with the Black Vultures for 22 years. Before that, he'd been a different kind of man in a different kind of uniform, which he never discussed in specifics, but which explained a number of things about the way he operated. The methodical precision, the ability to hold large amounts of information in working memory simultaneously, the particular way he went still, and focused when the information in front of him was serious. Right now, he was serious. He'd laid the 6 photographs in a row along the top of the workbench. Below them, the 4 handwritten sheets from Jesse Vale's documentation. Below that, the invoices. 14 pages of fleet maintenance records with handwritten annotations in the margins, circled numbers, dates underlined twice. The USB drive sat at the end of the row. He hadn't plugged it in yet. Cade stood beside him. The two of them had been doing this for years, processing situations side by side without needing to narrate the process, each thinking through a different angle of the same problem, sometimes arriving at the same place at different times, sometimes one of them seeing something the other missed. Roots, Bones said. He pointed at one of the annotated invoice pages without touching it. Eastern Tennessee, southeastern Kentucky, a corridor running northeast, roughly every 3 to 4 weeks, consistent for at least 2 years prior to Jesse noting the irregularities. Loads, Cade said. Agricultural equipment. That's what's listed. But the weight discrepancies, Bones pointed at a circled number, are significant enough that someone had to be falsifying the way station records too, which means the network isn't just the trucking operation. Way stations are state infrastructure. Yeah, the implication sat between them. Willa had moved to the other side of the workbench and was looking at the photographs. She hadn't touched them. She was looking at the one showing the county deputy, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone revisiting a wound they'd learned to carry but hadn't healed. You know him, Cade said. Not a question. She didn't look up. He came to our house after my dad died, said it was a routine follow-up, stayed for 40 minutes and asked my aunt questions she didn't know how to answer. A pause. He looked at me the whole time. Not at her. At me. She finally looked up. I was 11. I didn't understand what it meant then. What do you think it meant? Bones said. He was checking how much I knew. Her voice was flat. Deciding whether I was a problem. Bones looked at Cade. Cade looked at the photograph. He decided you weren't, Cade said. He decided I was 11 and terrified and had nobody and wouldn't ever have the resources to become a problem. She set her fingertip against the edge of the photograph, not touching the man's image, but the edge of the building behind him. He was right, for 8 years. I didn't have anything. I didn't know where my dad kept the documents. I found the envelope by accident, going through a storage unit last year. Some of his old shop things got transferred there after the fire, and nobody ever cleared it out. And the drawing, Cade said. Her hand moved away from the photograph. It was folded inside the envelope. I didn't know what it was, just that it was my dad's handwriting on the annotations. The bike design was someone else's. She looked at Cade with something careful in her expression. I kept it because it felt like the last thing he was working on before everything ended. I didn't know who drew the bike itself. Danny, Cade said. Your brother. Yeah. The word came out with the precise amount of weight 8 years of carrying something gave a word. Not dramatic, not broken, just heavy. Willa looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her assessment of him. A recalibration, subtle but visible to anyone paying attention. From across the garage, a voice said, "This needs to be a full-table conversation." Tito. His name was Priest. Despite the name, he was not a man of patience or particular mercy, which had led to a standing joke in the club about the gap between what a man was called and what a man was. He was 51 years old, the president of the Black Vultures MC, with a face that looked like it had been through several rounds of an argument with the physical world and emerged permanently altered. Gray-streaked beard, eyes the particular pale blue of a winter sky that contained no warmth. He'd come in from the back of the building during the workbench conversation, coffee mug in hand, wearing a thermal shirt with the sleeves pushed up despite the cold, his cut over the top of it. He'd been listening for 2 minutes. Now he was standing at the end of the workbench and looking at the documents with those cold blue eyes and the expression of a man adding up figures he didn't love the total of. "Full table," he said again. "Now." "It's 4 in the morning," Hatcher said from near the door. Priest looked at him. Hatcher stopped talking. The table was 8 feet long and scarred with years of use. Burns from cigarettes and soldering irons, stains from oil and coffee, and things older than anyone remembered, initials carved at the corner by a member 3 years dead. 8 chairs around it, mismatched, none of them comfortable. The Black Vultures had 9 full patch members currently in Harlan Falls. One was 3 weeks out on a personal matter that nobody discussed in front of outsiders. 8 men settled into chairs with the particular heaviness of men who had been awake too long and were about to be awake longer. Willa stood at the edge of the room. "Sit down," Priest said without looking at her. "I'm not a member of anything." "No, but you're the reason we're having this conversation at 4 in the morning, so sit down." A beat. She sat. Priest put both hands flat on the table and looked at Cade. "Tell me." Cade told him. All of it. The drawing, the name, the documents, the roots, the deputy, the 8-year gap between the fire and tonight. He told it without embellishment and without the emotional freight he was actually carrying, because that was how you presented information when you needed other people to assess it clearly without your grief contaminating their judgment. When he finished, the table was quiet. Priest looked at the documents spread in front of him. He looked at the photographs. He picked up the picture of the deputy and looked at it for 10 seconds, then set it down. "Hargrove," he said. Cade went still. "You know him." "I know of him." Priest leaned back. 3 years ago, chapter down in Chattanooga had a situation. Member's girlfriend, domestic thing. She went to the county. Report somehow never made it into the system. When they pushed, they got a visit from a deputy named Hargrove, who explained the value of community cooperation. He paused. That was Bledsoe County. "Same jurisdiction," Bones said. "Same jurisdiction. Same man." Priest looked at Cade. "I should have connected that to Danny's case. I didn't." The weight of that statement occupied the air above the table for several seconds. "You couldn't have known," Cade said. "Maybe." Priest's voice had no absolution in it, for himself or anyone else. "Doesn't matter now." He looked at Willa. "Who else knows you have those documents?" "Nobody." "Nobody meaning nobody you told, or nobody including people who might have seen you with them?" Willa thought about it. Really thought about it. "Ruth. She knew I had something, but not what. She wouldn't—" "Ruth has been in that town for 40 years, Priest said. Not harsh, just laying the math out. If someone comes asking Ruth about you, Ruth is going to be afraid. Afraid people fill spaces with words when silence would have served them better." Willa's mouth closed. "So we assume they know she had papers," Priest said. "We assume they know she's gone from the diner. We do not assume they know she's here." He looked around the table. "We have a window. I don't know how wide it is." Decker set a plate of food in front of Willa without ceremony, the way he'd apparently decided this was going to happen regardless of what the table was discussing. Scrambled eggs, canned beans, toast made on the camp stove. She stared at it for a second, then picked up the fork. Nobody commented. "The USB drive," Bones said. "Yeah." Priest looked at it. "Let's see what's on it." What was on it took 30 minutes to get through. Decker had a laptop, old, half the stickers peeled off, a crack across the bottom left corner of the screen. And he opened it on the table, and they all looked at the screen together with the specific collective attention of people who are trying to understand something they already half understand and are afraid the full understanding is worse than the half. Jesse Vale had been thorough, not in the organized, professional way of someone trained in documentation, in the meticulous, slightly obsessive way of a man who understood that what he had found was the kind of thing that ended people, and who therefore wanted to make sure that if it ended him, it couldn't end the record of it. The USB contained photographs, scanned documents, handwritten notes transferred to typed files, and a folder labeled simply audio that contained 6 recordings. The photographs were better quality than the physical ones. More of them, more context. Some with visible license plates partially readable, some with timestamps in the corner. The documents were invoices and route manifests, and 2 that appeared to be internal communication between parties who had been careful enough to use first names only, and careless enough to include enough identifying details that cross-referencing with the other documents produced names. Bones wrote the names down in a small notebook he kept in his cut. He wrote slowly and clearly, the way a man writes things he wants to be certain he hasn't misread. When he was done, he had 6 names. 2 were the businessmen in the photographs. One was Hargrove. One was a name Cade had seen on county administration paperwork 8 years ago, a man involved in the fire investigation who had signed off on the final ruling. The 5th name was a state-level official that produced a silence around the table with a different quality than the silences before it. The quality of men recalibrating how large a thing they were looking at. The 6th name, Bones wrote down. He circled twice. Then he looked at Cade. And Cade looked at the name, and the cigarette in Hatcher's hand burned down to his fingers unnoticed. The name was a man Cade knew personally, had known for years, a man who had attended Danny's funeral and stood at the grave and said the things people said at graves with what had appeared at the time to be genuine grief. A man who had, in the 3 years after Danny's death, quietly steered the Black Vultures away from certain lines of inquiry without appearing to do so. Small suggestions. Redirections that felt organic at the time. A comment here, a topic dropped there. A man who was, and had been for the last 4 years, a trusted associate of the club. His name was Reuben Cross, and he was asleep in the loft above them right now. The table didn't erupt. That was the thing about men who had been through enough. They didn't erupt. The pressure went somewhere internal, and they sat with it, and the silence thickened, and the fluorescent lights buzzed, and outside the cold was pressing against the corrugated walls, and none of them looked at the ladder to the loft, and none of them said the name out loud. Willa was watching them. She'd finished the food. She'd set the fork down. She was looking around the table, reading the shift in atmosphere with the same survival-calibrated attention she'd been reading rooms with her whole life, and she understood that something had changed, but not what exactly. "What is it?" she said. Nobody answered her. "What's on that list?" she said. Priest looked at Cade. The look lasted 3 seconds and carried a full conversation. Cade said, "Someone we know." Willa looked at the loft. Back at Cade. Back at the loft. "He's up there," she said. Not a question. "Don't," Priest said, quietly, but with absolute authority. "You don't move. You don't make noise. You sit." She sat. Priest stood up from the table very slowly, the way a large man moves when he is being deliberate about not making sound. He looked at Decker, then at the ladder. Decker's hand moved to the workbench beside him, to a specific location on the workbench that Cade didn't need to see in detail to understand. "Here's what we don't do," Priest said, very quietly. "We don't go up that ladder. Not tonight. Not without knowing more than we know." "He could be on a phone right now," Hatcher said. His voice had the controlled agitation of someone 28 years old trying to sound like someone twice that. "He could be asleep," Priest said. "We don't know what he is right now. We don't know the full shape of his involvement. We don't know what he has and hasn't communicated to anyone. Moving on incomplete information is how people die." He looked at Hatcher directly. "Are you hearing me?" Hatcher breathed out through his nose. "Yeah." "Good." Priest looked at Cade. "You and me. Outside, Marseille." The cold outside the garage was absolute. They stood on the far side of the building away from the overhead light, by the dead railroad tracks, breath visible in the dark. No wind, the kind of night that pressed down. Priest had his hands in the front pockets of his jeans and was looking at the tracks. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking Reuben has been with us for 4 years," Cade said. I'm thinking he came to us 6 months after I started pushing the club to look harder at Danny's case. I'm thinking when I stopped pushing, because he kept giving me quiet reasons why it was bad timing, why the club wasn't positioned for it, why Danny would want us to move forward. I thought he was being reasonable. He paused. I thought he was being a friend. He might still have been, Priest said. People are complicated arrangements of things. He knew about the trafficking network. His name is in Jesse Vale's documents. That's 8 years ago. If he was involved from the start, or he was brought in later, or he was leveraged, or he stumbled into information the same way Jesse did and made a different choice about what to do with it. Priest turned to look at him. I'm not defending him. I'm telling you that you can't go up that ladder tonight with your brother's death in your hands and Reuben Cross's name on a piece of paper and arrive at anything useful. Cade was quiet. 8 years, he said. I know. He stood at Danny's grave. I know. Priest's voice was careful, not soft, careful. Which is why this has to be done right, because if you go up that ladder tonight, you end the thing before we understand the shape of it. And everyone in those documents, he tilted his head toward the garage. Everyone who killed your brother and Jesse Vale and used those routes for 8 years, they walk. Because we didn't wait 36 hours to understand what we were holding. The railroad tracks caught the ambient light from somewhere distant, a facility a half-mile away, and gleamed dully in the cold. She can't stay here, Cade said. No. If Reuben's been reporting on the club's movements, this location may already be known. Yeah. Priest looked at the building. We move her in the morning, somewhere off the map. I've got a place in Cumberland County, old fishing cabin, no registered connection to the club. She won't go easily. She came this far. She came this far because she trusted the information I was reading off her. She's not compliant. Cade stopped. What? She's like him, Cade said. She's like Danny was. Same kind of stubborn, same kind of brave that doesn't know it's stupid yet. He said it without sentiment, just as observed fact. She's going to want to run her own play. We have to get ahead of that. Priest was quiet for a moment. The audio files. Yeah. We didn't get to those. No. They looked at each other. Come back inside, Priest said. The audio files were 6 recordings of varying lengths, the longest 11 minutes, the shortest 40 seconds. They were recorded on what sounded like a phone in a pocket, ambient noise throughout, muffled, voices occasionally distant. Jesse Vale hadn't been an intelligence operative. He'd been a mechanic with a bad feeling and a phone, and the particular determination of a man who understood he was in over his head and was trying to document himself a lifeline. The first 4 recordings were partial conversations. Fragments, names, numbers, enough to corroborate the written documents, but not to add significantly to them. The 5th recording lasted 8 minutes and 20 seconds. Halfway through it, Willa put both hands flat on the table and looked at the laptop screen like it was a thing she wanted to pick up and throw through the corrugated wall. Because halfway through the 5th recording, her father's voice shifted from the cautious muttering of a man trying to capture information to something else. Something urgent and low and stripped of the carefulness he'd been maintaining. Because halfway through the 5th recording, her father said, not to a phone, but to a man sitting across from him in what sounded like a vehicle. They're not just moving them, Jess. They're keeping some of them. There's a location. I've got an address. And then a second voice said his name. Not Jesse. The second voice said a different name, a name that meant the conversation wasn't between Jesse and a stranger. The name the second voice said was Danny. Cade's hands were on the table. The recording continued. Danny's voice, older than Cade remembered, rougher, carrying something it hadn't carried when they were young, said, "How many?" And Jesse said, "I don't know. At least..." And there was a sound, something exterior, and then Jesse said very fast and very quiet, "We can't meet here again. I'll get the address to you. The invoices are..." And then the recording ended. 48 hours later, according to the fire investigation report, Danny Mercer had died. 11 days after that, Jesse Vale. Cade was aware of his own heartbeat in a way he hadn't been since Kandahar. The specific awareness of a body under duress reminding itself it was still operational. Nobody at the table spoke. Willa was looking at the laptop screen with her jaw set and her eyes dry in the determined way of a person who has decided in advance that they will not cry in front of people they don't know well enough to cry in front of, and is holding that decision by force of will alone. They died because they found where they were keeping people, she said. Yeah, Bones said. And that location... She stopped. It might still be operational. 8 years is a long time, Hatcher started. Networks don't shut down, Priest said. They evolve, adapt, move. He looked at the documents. The routes might have changed. The people running it might have changed. The infrastructure... He shook his head. The 6th recording, Bones said. They all looked at the laptop. The 6th recording was 40 seconds long. Decker hit play. It was Jesse Vale's voice, alone, clearly speaking directly into the phone, clearly agitated in a way the other recordings hadn't contained. The agitation not of a man afraid in the moment, but of a man who knows that moments are running out and is trying to put something durable into the world before they do. He said, "If someone finds this, whoever you are, however you got here, the address is in the drawing. Danny knows the system. The measurements and the margins aren't measurements. If you're holding that drawing, you're holding the address. I'm sorry I couldn't do more. Tell my daughter I..." And then it cut out. The garage was completely silent except for the wood stove and the fluorescent lights, and from somewhere in the loft above them, the sound of Reuben Cross shifting in his sleep. Willa reached into her backpack. She took out the drawing. She set it on the table in front of Cade, and he looked at the margins of his dead brother's custom motorcycle design, at the annotations written in Jesse Vale's hand, at the numbers that were not measurements, and understood, with the cold clarity of a thing finally completing itself after 8 years of being unfinished, exactly what they were. Coordinates. The address still existed. Whatever Danny and Jesse had found 8 years ago, it was still there, annotated in pencil on a piece of notebook paper that a 19-year-old girl had kept taped under a diner counter because it was the last thing her father ever touched. Cade picked up the drawing with both hands and held it carefully, the way you hold something you understand the weight of. Above them, in the loft, a floorboard creaked. Then came a sound that every man at that table recognized from experience, the specific, unmistakable sound of a phone screen lighting up in the dark. The brief illumination of a screen reflecting off a ceiling for 1 second before it was covered by a hand. Someone in the loft had just received a message, or sent one. Priest looked at Cade. Cade set the drawing down, and in the long, cold, terrible second that followed, as every man at the table understood simultaneously that the window Priest had spoken about outside was no longer 36 hours wide, but possibly 36 minutes, Reuben Cross's feet appeared at the top of the ladder, coming down. Reuben Cross came down the ladder one rung at a time. He was wearing a gray thermal and jeans and boots he'd pulled on before descending, which meant he'd been awake long enough to put on boots, which meant the phone screen in the loft hadn't been a message received, but a message sent. His face was arranged in the expression of a man who has just woken up and heard movement below and come down to investigate. And it was a good expression, practiced, natural, containing exactly the right proportion of grogginess and mild curiosity. If Cade hadn't spent 11 years reading people in conditions where misreading costs lives, he might have believed it. He didn't believe it. Reuben's right foot found the concrete floor, and he turned and looked at the table with 8 men around it, and a girl he'd never seen before, and a laptop open in the center, and documents spread across the surface. And for exactly 1 second, something moved across his face that wasn't grogginess or curiosity. 1 second, then it was gone. "Late one," he said. His voice had the hoarseness of real sleep, which meant he'd been asleep for part of the night, which meant the phone had woken him. He ran a hand through his hair, looked at Willa. "Who's this?" "Come sit down," Priest said. "I'm asking who—" "Reuben." Priest's voice was very quiet. "Sit down." The specific quality of Priest's voice in that register was something every man in the club knew. It wasn't a request with a please implied. It was the voice of a man who had already made several decisions and was offering you one last opportunity to choose which side of them you landed on. Reuben Cross had been around the club long enough to know that voice. He pulled a chair from the wall and sat at the end of the table. Nobody moved the documents toward him. Nobody moved them away. Priest looked at Bones. Bones turned the laptop screen to face Reuben and pressed play on the 5th audio file. They all watched Reuben Cross listen to Jesse Vale's voice document a trafficking network. They watched him listen to Danny Mercer's voice in the background of that recording, asking how many. They watched him hear the address coordinates embedded in the drawing. They watched him do the thing people did when something hit them they weren't prepared for, which was absolutely nothing. The face going to neutral in a way that wasn't natural, but was the best available defense against a room full of people watching closely. When it ended, Priest closed the laptop. "Long version or short version?" Priest said. Reuben's hats were flat on the table. "I don't know what you want me to—" "Your name is in Jesse Vale's documents," Cade said. His voice came out of a place that had no weather in it, no heat, just the flatness of something past the point of feeling anything that would interfere with clarity. Not peripheral. Not contextual. Central. Reuben looked at him. "Your name is in the same documents that got Danny killed," Cade said. "I want to understand how it got there." A long silence. Reuben Cross was 50 years old. He'd come to the club the way a lot of men came, through an introduction, through a useful skill set, through the particular social gravity that formed around a chapter that had a reputation and a territory and needed certain things done well. He was a logistics man. New trucking routes, supply chains, the administrative geography of how things moved through a region. He'd been useful in ways that had never prompted the specific questions his usefulness should have prompted. And looking at that now, Cade felt the particular nausea of a man understanding in real time exactly how well he'd been managed. "I was running freight in this corridor 8 years ago," Reuben said. Not fast. Careful. Like a man not lying but choosing which true things to say. "Standard stuff. I knew some of the operators. I didn't know what was in the loads." "Your name is in a list of people who did," Bones said. "Because I was subcontracted. I handled scheduling on 2 of those routes for 4 months. I didn't know—" He stopped, started again. "When I found out, I stopped. I walked away from the contract and I didn't report it because I didn't have a death wish." "When did you find out?" Priest said. 6 months before Danny died." The table absorbed that. 6 months, Cade said. "I know what you're thinking." "I doubt it." "I know that timeline looks— It looks like you knew what Danny had found because you already knew what the network was," Cade said. "It looks like you joining this club 6 months after he died wasn't coincidence. It looks like 4 years of steering me away from asking questions was deliberate." He didn't raise his voice. He had no voice to raise. The words were coming from somewhere with no temperature at all. "Tell me I'm wrong." Reuben's jaw worked. "Tell me," Cade said. "I didn't know Danny was dead until after it happened." Reuben's voice had lost its careful calibration. Something underneath it was surfacing. Not the polished version of the man, but whatever lived beneath the polish. Something that had been under pressure for a long time. I had no idea they'd move on him that fast. On both of them. When I heard about the fire, He stopped. "You were scared," Bones said. "I was terrified." The word came out raw. "I was a man who'd handled 2 months of logistics for people who killed 2 people in 2 weeks. I had a name on a piece of paper somewhere in a dead man's files, and I had no way of knowing what that dead man had kept and what he hadn't and whether they already knew that I knew." He looked at the table. "I came to this club because I needed to be somewhere protected. You thought we were cover," Priest said. A silence that had a different quality than the ones before it. "Not just cover," Reuben said. "I thought if I was useful enough, if I was here long enough—" He stopped, tried again. "I thought eventually I'd tell you, when it was safe." 4 years, Cade said. "There was never a point where it was safe." "Because you were making sure of that." Cade leaned forward slightly, just enough. "Every time I wanted to push the investigation, every time I had momentum on it, you had a reason, bad timing, club wasn't positioned, Danny wouldn't want this." He paused. "You used my brother's name to protect yourself." Reuben's face did something complicated that didn't have a clean name. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't," Cade said, very quietly. "Don't do that right now." Priest held up one hand, a flat horizontal gesture that asked for silence and got it. "The phone," Priest said. "Upstairs. Who did you contact?" Reuben's eyes moved briefly, involuntarily, toward Cade and then back to Priest. "Nobody," he said. The fluorescent light buzzed. Decker, who had been standing at the edge of the room with the stillness of a man who kept a specific emotional distance from other people's conflict until the moment it became necessary not to, walked to the ladder and went up it in 4 steps. They could hear him moving in the loft. The sound of something dragged across the floor. Then he came back down carrying Reuben's phone. He put it on the table. Priest looked at it, then at Reuben. "Screen's been cleared," Decker said. "Recent calls erased. Texts deleted." The sound of the wood stove was very loud in the silence. Reuben was looking at the table. Not at the phone. Not at Cade. At the specific section of table surface directly in front of him, with the expression of a man who has just gone through a door and heard it close behind him. "How long do we have?" Priest said. Reuben said nothing. "Reuben," Priest's voice dropped to something almost conversational. "I have known you for 4 years. I have eaten with you and ridden with you and trusted you at my back. I am asking you, one last time, as that man, how long do we have?" A pause that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. "I don't know," Reuben said. I told them the club had picked up a girl at a diner in Sevier County and she had documents. I didn't give them the address here." "But they know we're in Harlan Falls," Bones said. "They know the chapter is based in Harlan Falls. They don't know this specific building." "They've had 4 years to figure out this specific building," Hatcher said. Reuben looked up. "I never told them." "You didn't have to tell them." Hatcher's voice had the particular cutting edge of a young man's anger, which had no patience in it yet for complicated truths. "You've been with us 4 years. You've been here. If anyone in their network ran basic surveillance on this town looking for Black Vulture's activity, that's enough," Priest said. Hatcher went quiet, but his jaw was hard. Priest stood up. He stood up the way large, deliberate men stood up when they had made a decision and were moving into the execution of it. "Decker, pack what we need to move. Essentials only, the bikes, the documents, 20 minutes. He looked at Hatcher. "Wake up Garza and Torres. Tell them quiet and fast." He looked at Cade. "You and Willa, back of the building. Now." "What about him, Woods?" Cade said. Priest looked at Reuben Cross for a long moment. "He comes with us," Priest said, "because he's the only one who knows what's coming and we need to understand the full shape of it before this is over." He leaned down and put both hands on the table in front of Reuben. "And because if I leave him here and he makes another call, everything ends badly for everyone, including him." He straightened. "Move." The garage became a controlled dismantling in 18 minutes. Not chaos. The Black Vultures had the particular practiced efficiency of people who had moved fast before under pressure and had learned which corners to cut and which could not be cut. Sleeping bags rolled. The documents from the workbench replaced in the envelope inside Cade's cut. The laptop. 2 weapons that lived in specific locations under specific workbenches that only specific people knew about. A canvas bag from the back office that Priest carried himself without explaining to anyone. Willa stood at the back of the building where Cade had put her and watched the controlled emergency with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a system she wasn't part of. Her backpack was on. She'd put it on the moment Cade told her to go to the back of the building, which meant she'd been ready to move before she was asked to. He noted that. "Where are we going?" she said. "Cumberland County. Fishing cabin. Off-grid." "How far?" "Hour and a half." She looked toward the front of the building where the sound of boots and low, urgent voices and the metallic sounds of preparation were still audible. He called them. "Yeah." Before he came down the ladder. Before he came down. She was quiet for a moment. How much did he tell them? Enough. She absorbed that. They're going to come here. Probably. How many? Cade looked at her. I don't know yet. Her breath came out in a slow, visible cloud in the cold air. She looked at the frozen ground at her feet, and then back up. Your brother trusted my father, she said. My father trusted yours. And both of them died because someone they didn't know they shouldn't trust was close enough to the edge of what they were doing to see it. Yeah. So you understand why I need to know I'm not doing the same thing right now. He looked at her directly. In the flat, cold light coming through the back ventilation gap, She looked younger than 19 and older simultaneously. The particular combination that came from a life that had asked more from a person than a person that age should have been asked. Her eyes were steady, not fearless, steady. There was a difference. "My brother died for this," he said. "I am not going to let that become a reason for you to die for it too." She held his gaze. "Okay," she said. It was the same word she'd said in the parking lot behind the diner, and it had the same quality. Not easy trust, not blind faith, but a calculated decision made by someone who understood the math and had chosen the better option available to them. It was the kind of okay that meant, "I'm choosing this with my eyes open, and if it goes wrong, that's on both of us." He respected it. "Let's go," he said. They rode out in the dark in a tight group, no headlights for the first quarter mile, using just the ambient from the industrial facility down the road, and then onto the county road heading west, where Priest took them on a route that used two-lane state roads through the mountain dark instead of the highway. Cold pressed in from every direction. The temperature had dropped another 4 degrees while they were inside and now sat at the kind of number that made extended exposure on a motorcycle a medical consideration. Willa had Cade's spare helmet and a borrowed jacket over her coat, Bones's spare, which was 3 sizes large, but the leather was thick and cut the wind. She'd said nothing when he handed it to her. Just put it on. Reuben Cross rode in the middle of the formation with Priest directly ahead and Decker directly behind, and nobody had cuffed him or zip-tied him because they weren't the kind of organization that did that to men they'd ridden with for 4 years, but nobody had to articulate the arrangement either. He understood where he was. For the first 40 minutes of the ride, Cade's mind processed rather than rested. The coordinates in the drawing. 8 years old. A location that Jesse Vale had encoded specifically because he understood that whatever was there was worth protecting the knowledge of, worth dying to preserve the record of. A place where Danny had asked how many in a voice that Cade now couldn't get out of his head. Not the Danny of their childhood, not the brother he'd memorized, but an older version. A Danny who'd found something terrible and had been trying to decide what to do about it in the limited time he had before the decision was made for him. The drawing was against Cade's chest inside the cut. He could feel it. Yet. The fishing cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that took 20 minutes to navigate from the county route, deep enough into the Cumberland Plateau that the tree cover was total, and the only light was what they brought with them. One room, a sleeping loft, a kitchen corner with a wood stove, a covered porch that looked out over a creek that was currently frozen. No registered connection to any Black Vultures member, held under a land trust that Priest had set up 6 years ago for reasons he'd described at the time as general preparedness. They pulled in and cut engines, and for a moment there was just the darkness and the creek and the cold. Inside, the wood stove got going within 10 minutes. Decker had the efficiency of a man who'd made camps in far worse conditions. The cabin filled slowly with orange light and the smell of burning pine and the sounds of men doing specific things with the particular economy of a group under stress trying to function. Priest took Reuben to the far corner of the room. They spoke in voices low enough that the words didn't carry, but the shape of the conversation did. Priest steady, Reuben answering things, Priest asking more, Reuben's posture going through a series of shifts that mapped the contours of a man surrendering information incrementally, each piece costing him something. Cade stood at the window and watched the tree line. Bones came and stood beside him. They didn't speak for a while. Then Bones said quietly, "He's giving Priest more than he gave the table." "I know. There's a reason he held things back down there." "There are things he's more afraid of than Priest," Cade said. Bones thought about that. "Things in the documents we haven't fully processed yet. Or people. The state-level official. Or above." Bones was quiet. Willa had found a corner near the stove and was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her knees up, looking at the room with the contained watchfulness of someone who was exhausted but had made the decision not to sleep until she understood more about her situation. She'd taken Danny's drawing out of the envelope and was looking at it, tracing the pencil lines of the motorcycle design with her eyes without touching the paper. Cade crossed the room and crouched down in front of her. She held up the drawing between them. "Have you looked at them yet?" she said. "The numbers. On the road. In my head." "And?" Crossroads Township, eastern edge of the county, about 12 miles from where your father's shop was. Her expression didn't change on the surface, but something behind it went very still. That close. Operating locally made it easier to manage. Less distance equals less exposure. 8 years, she said. I know. If it's still... She stopped. If there are still people there, we don't go in blind, he said. We don't go in under-resourced. And we don't go in until we know the full shape of what we're walking into. That's not a no. No, it's not. She looked at the drawing for a moment longer. Then she folded it carefully along the original creases and held it out to him. When he took it, she held on for 1 second before letting go. A half second of weight, the specific gravity of something a person has been carrying alone for a long time. He put it back inside his cut. From the corner, Priest's voice suddenly rose a register. Not shouting, but hitting a register that Priest's voice rarely hit, which in some ways carried more alarm than shouting would have. Say that again, Priest said. Reuben said something. Priest stood up straight and turned and looked at Cade across the room. The expression on Priest's face was one Cade had seen exactly once before, at a roadside in Helmand Province, when a man he'd trusted with his life had opened a door that wasn't supposed to be opened. The expression of a person encountering a scale of wrongness that briefly exceeds their capacity to frame it. Everyone, Priest said. Here, now. Mats. They gathered around the table that wasn't a table, the wooden crate and 2 sawhorses that served that function in the cabin, with flashlights supplementing the stove light and breath visible in the air above them because the cabin hadn't fully warmed yet. Priest stood at the head of it. He looked at each of them in turn before he spoke. It was something he did when he was calibrating, reading the room, assessing the load-bearing capacity of the people in it, deciding how to distribute weight. I need everyone to stay in their seat for what I'm about to say, he said. I need everybody to listen all the way through before they react. Can everyone do that? Not a question. An instruction with a question's shape. What Reuben has just told me changes the size of what we're dealing with. Priest paused. The trafficking network that Jesse Vale documented, it wasn't a regional operation run by county officials and businessmen using trucking routes. He stopped, started again. That was the ground floor. Those were the logistics. The people making money off the logistics. He looked at Cade specifically. The people who ordered the fires, who ordered Danny and Jesse killed. They aren't in Bledsoe County. They aren't in Tennessee. Where? Bones said. 3 of the names in Jesse's documents are cutouts, Priest said. Local faces on a structure that runs northeast. D.C. corridor. He let that sit for 1 second. Hargrove didn't order those fires. He reported to the man who did. The man who did has been operating a protected network for going on 15 years through multiple states. The reason the investigation closed in 6 weeks is because someone with the authority to close federal investigations closed it. Hatcher's chair scraped. Stay seated, Priest said. Hatcher stayed seated. His hands were on the table and his knuckles had gone white. The USB drive, Bones said slowly. Jesse Vale had this level of documentation. Jesse Vale had names without context. He knew the local structure. He didn't know what it connected to. Priest looked at Reuben. Reuben knew more because after he walked away from the freight contract, someone came to him, explained the scope, explained why walking away wasn't enough and reporting wasn't an option. He paused, and explained what would happen to him if he made any move that created exposure. They recruited him, Decker said. They managed him. There's a difference. Priest looked at the room. He has been watched for 8 years. His proximity to this club was known. His movements have been monitored. Then they know everything we know, Hatcher said. They know what Reuben knows, which is the documents, the girl, and the coordinates. Priest looked at Cade. They don't know the drawing. They don't know the coordinates have been decoded. They know she has papers. They don't know the papers contain a location. For how long, Cade said. Unknown. But right now, tonight, we have something they don't know we have. Cade looked at the cut over his chest, at the shape of the folded drawing inside it. How many people are currently at that location, he said. Priest looked at Reuben. Reuben's hands were flat on the table. He was looking at a spot between them with the expression of a man who had been carrying something for years and was now putting it down in public, and was uncertain what he looked like without it. "The last count I was given," Reuben said, his voice stripped of everything now except the bare information, "was between 18 and 22. The number went around the table. People. Not operators. Not guards. People. Willa made a sound that wasn't a word, just a sharp exhalation, the involuntary response of a body to information it wasn't braced for. She had both hands pressed flat on her knees. She was staring at the crate between them. "My dad found this 8 years ago," she said. "Yes," Priest said. "He found it and tried to document it, and they killed him for it. And then for 8 years, her voice caught on something, and she forced it past. "For 8 years while I was in foster care and aging out and waitressing in a mountain diner for a man who put his hands on me, there were between 18 and 22, Willa." Cade's voice was low. "Don't." She looked at him with something in her eyes that was past grief, past anger, in the territory where those things burned away and left just the core of a person who has decided something irrevocable. "Don't manage me right now." He didn't. She looked at Priest. "I want to know everything, all of it, whatever else he's been holding back." She nodded toward Reuben. "Everything, because I've been the collateral damage in this for 8 years, and I'm done being the person in the room who knows the least about what killed my father." Priest looked at her for a long moment, then he sat down. "All right," he said. What came next took 40 minutes. By the end of it, 3 of the men at the table had said nothing but had aged visibly in the way people aged when the world they thought they lived in turned out to be significantly different from the world they actually lived in. Hatcher had left the table once, stood up and walked to the door and stood there with his forehead against the cold wood for 45 seconds and then came back. Decker had gone very still in the way that preceded his most dangerous moods. Bones had filled 3 pages of his small notebook. The network had layers Cade hadn't imagined. The location had been operational for 11 years. Not the same physical address. It had moved twice in that time. The coordinates Jesse Vale had encoded, leading to a structure that had since been transferred to a new location 6 miles further northeast, which Reuben knew because 3 years ago he'd been given the new address as a reminder of what he was protecting by staying quiet. The structure received and processed through the trucking routes. It held people who were then moved through a secondary logistics chain up the northeastern corridor. The local operators managed the physical side. The financial side operated behind 3 layers of legitimate business and was currently under the partial protection of a federal official who had the authority to redirect or terminate any investigation that came within 10 miles of it. The federal official's name was in Reuben's phone, the phone that had been cleared, which meant the federal official now knew that Reuben Cross had been with the Black Vulture's MC when a girl carrying Jesse Vale's documents had been picked up at a mountain diner and had subsequently gone silent. "They're not coming for the girl," Cade said. Everyone looked at him. "They're coming for the documents," he said, "and for everyone who's seen them." He looked at Priest. "Reuben going dark is a containment trigger, standard protocol. They don't send 2 deputies and a black SUV. He paused. "They send people with federal clearance and documented authority to clean a situation." The wood stove popped and settled. "How long?" Bones said. "Could already be moving," Cade said. "Depends on how close their nearest resource is. Could be 6 hours. Could be less." "We have to run," Hatcher said. "Running puts us on roads," Priest said. "Staying puts us in a box. Running without a direction puts us in a smaller box." Priest looked at Cade. "You're already thinking about the location." "I've been thinking about it since the 5th audio file." Going there is the only move that changes the math." Cade kept his voice level. "We run. We're fugitives with documents that federal protection makes inadmissible and a story that sounds insane without physical evidence. We sit, we wait for people with resources we can't match to arrive at a location they will eventually identify." He looked around the table. "We go to that location, we bring back evidence that exists outside the document chain. Physical evidence that no federal clearance can retroactively reclassify. And we take it somewhere public enough that covering it becomes more expensive than uncovering it." "You're describing an action that involves approximately 8 bikers approaching a defended location at night," Bones said. I'm describing the only option that has a variable outcome. The others, all certain. A long silence. Willis said, very quietly, "My father died trying to build a record. Your brother died trying to understand what the record meant. Nobody moved on the information. Nobody went there." She looked at the table. Maybe that's been the problem. Nobody answered her. Outside, somewhere in the frozen dark above the creek, something moved in the tree line. It might have been wind. Cade was at the window before the thought was complete, his hand on the frame, eyes into the darkness, reading the tree line the way he'd been trained to read terrain that might contain things that wanted him dead. Hatcher was behind him 2 seconds later. Bones had his hand on the lamp before Cade said anything. "Kill the light," Cade said. The cabin went dark. In the darkness, from somewhere down the dirt road, not close, but not far enough, came the sound of an engine, not a motorcycle engine. Something heavier, something moving slowly without headlights, the way vehicles moved when they were trying to arrive at a location without being heard. From the distance they estimated their target was listening from. They had estimated wrong. Cade had better ears than they'd accounted for. He turned from the window in the dark and found Willa by sound and put his hand on her arm and moved her toward the back wall. And she went without arguing, which meant she'd heard it too or read it in him, and the black vultures moved in the darkness of the cabin with the silent coordination of men who had stopped needing to speak to each other in order to function. And every single one of them understood simultaneously that the window Priest had spoken about back at the garage, the window of knowing something the other side didn't, had just closed. They knew where the cabin was. They'd been faster than anyone expected. And there was exactly one exit from that dirt road. The engine outside went quiet. The silence that followed was the worst kind. The silence of people being deliberate about their silence. The silence of a perimeter being established. The specific quiet of trained people taking positions in frozen dark around a building they believed they had the advantage on. Priest materialized beside Cade in the darkness. His voice was barely air. "How many you think?" Cade listened. "Multiple vehicles, minimum 8, could be 12. Exits. Back window, creek beyond, ice. We cross or we don't." Priest was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. The calculation of a man who had run out of options he preferred and was now selecting among options he didn't. "The documents," Priest said. "On me. The drive." "Bones has it." "Willa." "I have her." Priest put his hand briefly on Cade's shoulder. Not a gesture of comfort, a gesture of acknowledgement. The kind of contact that meant I know what I'm asking of you, and I'm asking it anyway. "Back window," Priest said. "Now." We go through the creek. And before Cade moved, in the frozen black silence of a cabin surrounded by people who had killed twice to protect a secret they'd maintained for 8 years, he reached inside his cut and pressed his hand flat against the folded drawing. His brother's last design. The last coordinates of a thing that needed ending. He thought, Danny. Then he moved. The creek was 8 inches of black water over frozen gravel, and it hit like a wall of needles when Cade went through it. He didn't stop. Stopping was death. He kept moving with Willa's hand locked in his left hand and the current pushing at his ankles and the cold doing the thing cold did when it was serious. Not burning, not stinging, just shutting systems down with the efficient indifference of a machine that didn't know it was hurting anything. Behind him he could hear the others. The specific sounds of heavy men moving fast through water, boots on ice-slicked rock, the controlled breathing of men who had been in bad situations before and knew that noise was the variable they could still control. Willa didn't make a sound crossing the creek. He'd expected a gasp, a catch of breath. Nothing. She crossed with her free hand out for balance and her jaw set and her eyes forward, and when they hit the far bank she was already looking for the tree line. He pulled her into the pines and turned. Behind them, the cabin was still dark. The vehicles on the dirt road hadn't moved yet. He could hear the engines ticking in the cold, the specific sound of hot metal in freezing air, which meant they'd arrived recently and were still positioning. Standard approach protocol for a situation like this was to establish perimeter before breaching, which bought the club approximately 4 minutes before someone moved on the back of the building and found the open window. Priest came through the creek last, moving with the deliberate, controlled speed of a large man who had made peace with discomfort a long time ago. He hit the bank and crouched beside Cade without speaking, both of them reading the darkness across the water. 8 men plus Willa in the tree line. Reuben Cross was one of the 8. Nobody had discussed what to do about that during the 30 seconds between the decision and the window. He was simply here, which meant either Priest had made a call or nobody had thought about it clearly enough in the dark to make a different one. Cade looked at him now. Reuben standing 6 feet away with water dripping from his jeans and his hands at his sides, and an expression that had moved past the complicated things into something simpler and harder. "How many contacts do they have on you?" Cade said. Low, direct. "One handler," Reuben said, "quarterly check-in. The message tonight was the first unsolicited contact in 8 months. That means they mobilized independently of your contact. Someone else triggered this." "The diner," Bones said. He was wringing water from his sleeve with methodical focus. "SUV in the lot after we left. They had eyes on the road, saw the formation leave, tracked it north." "That was 6 hours ago," Hatcher said. 6 hours is enough time to—" "Quiet!" Cade held up one hand. From across the creek, through the pines, the specific sound of a boot against a cabin wall. Someone testing the exterior. The beam of a red-filtered flashlight crossed the back window once and disappeared. 30 seconds. Then a voice, carrying cleanly through the cold air. "Windows open. They're mobile." Cade was already moving deeper into the trees before the words were complete, pulling Willow with him, the others falling in around them with the silent reformation of a group that had stopped needing direction for its basic functions. They moved northeast through the trees on a logging trail that Priest knew because Priest always knew the land around anywhere he kept a building. This was a habit so deeply ingrained it wasn't even deliberate anymore, just the way he moved through the world. Behind them, lights swept the far bank. They were being hunted now, with the formality of it confirmed and acknowledged on both sides. The only question was what they were running toward. They ran for 40 minutes through frozen pine forest before Priest stopped them at a ridgeline that looked down on a county road running east-west through the dark. No traffic, no lights. Below the ridgeline, the tree cover broke into a wide, flat section of cleared land that had once been a lumber operation and was now just open dark with the gray shapes of old equipment half visible under the ambient cloud light. 8 people standing in the freezing dark, breathing hard. Willa's breathing was controlled but labored, not the desperation of panic, the honest strain of someone who had been moving hard through difficult terrain. She had a cut on her left hand from a branch she'd caught in the dark, and she was applying pressure to it against her jacket without being asked. Cade looked at it, looked at her face. She looked back and gave him the small, specific nod that meant, "I'm functional, keep moving." He kept moving. "Bikes," Priest said. He was looking at the county road. "We need bikes." "Closest chapter is Cookville," Bones said, 40 miles. "We call, and we announce our position. We call on a phone that might be monitored." "Not might be. Is." Priest looked at Decker. "The burner." Decker reached into his jacket and produced a phone so old it had physical buttons, the kind that telecom networks still grudgingly supported because the infrastructure was grandfathered. He held it out. Priest took it. "Who do you trust that isn't in the chapter network?" Cade said. Priest was already dialing. "One person." He walked 10 feet away to make the call. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. He came back. "Old friend in Crossville has 2 trucks and enough sense not to ask questions until after," Priest said. 2 hours. "We don't have 2 hours clean," Bones said. "We have the woods and the dark, and they don't know this terrain," Priest said. "We move off the trail, spread out, go quiet. Standard evasion. 2 hours isn't comfortable, but it's achievable." Cade looked at the east. The coordinates in the drawing were 12 miles from Jesse Vale's old shop in Bledsoe County, which put them approximately 35 miles from where they were currently standing. 35 miles in trucks with a head start before the people behind them reoriented to their direction of travel. He said, "We go to the location." Priest looked at him. "You want to take a girl and 6 men who just ran through a creek to a defended site with no intel? We have intel." Cade reached into his cut and took out the drawing. Even in the near dark, the pencil lines were visible, Danny's precise architectural hand rendering a motorcycle that had never been built. We have coordinates. We have Ruben, who has the updated address 6 miles northeast of those coordinates. And we have 8 people who just became fugitives from a network that has federal protection, which means the only move that ends this in a way that lets us live normally afterward is ending it at the source. Define ending it, Bones said. Physical evidence. People with testimony. Something that exists outside the document chain they can suppress. Cade looked at the group. Ruben's handler knows his location was compromised. By morning, they'll be moving the operation. They do it every few years. He said it himself. If we're not there before they move, the coordinates become a dead field, and the network continues, and everyone in those trucks, everyone who's been there for 11 years, disappears into the next location and starts over. Silence. Willow was standing at the edge of the group. She'd stopped applying pressure to her hand. She was listening with the whole body attention of someone who understands that a decision is being made about their life without anyone explicitly acknowledging that's what's happening. I know what I'm asking, Cade said. I know what it costs. Do you? Hatcher's voice had an edge that wasn't aggression. It was the edge of a 28-year-old man trying to figure out where his own line was. Because last time I counted, it's 4 a.m. We've been running through frozen woods for 40 minutes. There are people with federal credentials somewhere behind us, and you want to go toward something. Yes. That's insane. The alternative is running indefinitely from people who won't stop, Cade said. You want to live in a cabin somewhere waiting for them to find you? Because they'll find you. You've seen what they're capable of. Hatcher looked at the ground, breathed. Yeah, he said. Nobody else argued. Priest looked at each of them in turn one more time. The read the room assessment. Then he made the second call on the burner phone. The trucks arrived at 3:40 in the morning, 2 F-250S, dark blue, driven by a heavy-set man named Carver, who had a gray beard and oil-stained hands, and the practiced incuriosity of someone who had been doing favors for Priest for 20 years and had learned that the fewer specifics he carried, the better he slept. He pulled over on a logging access road, killed his lights, and waited. They loaded in without ceremony. Cade and Willa in the back of the first truck with Bones and Hatcher, Priest in front with Carver, Ruben and Decker and 2 others in the second truck, which meant Ruben was in a vehicle without Cade watching him, which Cade noted and filed and accepted because there were not enough options to optimize everything. The trucks rolled east through the mountain dark. Willow was beside him on the bench seat with her shoulder against his arm, not leaning on him. Just close, the way 2 people were close when they were the same temperature, and the space was cold and neither of them had the energy to maintain unnecessary distance. She had the drawing again. He'd given it back to her without quite deciding to, somewhere in the forest, pressing it into her hands when they stopped to listen for pursuit. She held it in her lap now, both hands covering it. Tell me about him, she said. Cade looked at the dark outside the window. Danny. Yeah. He thought about how to do that. Thought about the particular difficulty of describing a person to someone who only knows them as a set of consequences. He was smarter than me, Cade said. Quieter. Thought longer before talking, which I never learned to do. He paused. He could look at an engine and see it the way other people saw faces. Individually, personally, like it had a character. Like it was worth understanding for its own sake. Another pause. He didn't belong in the life we ended up in. Neither did I guess, but I fit the shape of it better. Danny was always... He stopped. What? Too good for it, Cade said. Not sentimentally, just as fact. The club, the edges we operated on... Danny did it because I did it. Because we came up together and he wasn't going to let me go somewhere he couldn't follow. That was just how he was. He looked at his hands. He found something worth risking himself for, and he risked himself, and I wasn't there. Willa was quiet for a moment. My dad was the same way, she said. He wasn't brave the way people talk about brave. He wasn't looking for it. He was just incapable of knowing about something and not acting on it. She looked at the drawing in her lap. They were probably the same kind of stupid. Something moved in Cade's chest. Not grief. He'd been carrying grief long enough that it had lost its acute edges. Something different. Something adjacent to recognition. Probably, he said. She almost smiled. Not quite. The shape of an almost smile. Then Hatcher said from across the bench, 10 minutes out. And the almost smile went somewhere else. Gosso. Reuben's updated coordinates led them to a township road that dead-ended at a commercial property 3/4 of a mile off the main route. A long, flat building that had originally been a cold storage facility, surrounded by a fence line with 2 visible gate positions and light sources at the corners of the building. Security lighting, motion activated, currently dark because nothing was moving within their range yet. Carver pulled both trucks off-road 200 yards from the fence line into the shadow of a tree break and cut the engines. The night was completely still. Cold. Deep cold now, well below freezing, the kind that made metal creak and breath came in hard white clouds, and the ground rang faintly underfoot like it had turned to something harder than soil. The building was quiet. No visible movement. 2 vehicles parked in the lot near the main entrance. A box truck and a white van, both dark. The gate was closed, but the padlock was on the outside, which meant no one had entered recently, which meant either the facility was currently between operations or... Light, Bones said. Very quiet. Second-story window, right side of the building. A single light, low, the kind produced by a single lamp rather than overhead fluorescence. Intermittent movement across it. Someone walking past. Then stillness. Someone was inside. Cade and Priest moved to the front of the truck and crouched in the dark. Guards, Cade said. Minimum 2 at the gate position, more inside, Priest said. Cameras on the fence line. See the housing on the corner posts. Motion activated. Sends to a monitoring station. If the monitoring station is local, we have seconds from breach to response. If it's remote, it's local, Reuben said. He'd come up behind them silently, which caused both Cade and Priest to go still for 1 second before identifying the footstep. They run internal monitoring, a desk position inside the front of the building, 1 man, rotating 4-hour shifts. Cade looked at him. I told you everything in the cabin, Reuben said. I'm not playing 2 sides anymore. I'm here, aren't I? You're here, Cade said. That can mean different things. I drove past this building once, Reuben said. His voice was stripped down to something fundamental. 3 years ago. When they gave me the new address, I didn't get out of the car, I drove past, and I kept driving, and I've been trying to forget the shape of it ever since. He looked at the building. I know what's in there. I've known for 8 years. Do you understand what it is to know something for 8 years and not do anything about it? Cade looked at him for a long moment. He thought about his brother's grave, about every mile he'd put between himself and the question of how Danny died, about the specific exhaustion of carrying guilt in the shape of silence. Yeah, Cade said. I do. Reuben held his gaze. The desk position is left of the main entrance, Reuben said. There's a service entrance on the east wall. Loading dock. Camera housing on the east corner is older than the others, different manufacturer, wider gap in the motion field. Cade looked at Priest. Priest looked at the building. 6 of us on the building, Priest said. Carver and Willa stay with the trucks. I'm not... Willa started. Willa. Priest's voice was the quiet version, the final version. You're the one person here we cannot afford to lose before this is over. Because you're the one person here who has a documented chain of connection to Jesse Vale's evidence that doesn't run through this club. If something happens in that building and everyone in this group disappears, you and those documents are what remains. He looked at her. Do you understand what I'm saying? She understood. It was visible in the way she hated it. Fine, she said. The word had the texture of a door closed hard. Carver. Priest looked at the driver. If you hear anything that goes wrong in there, you take the girl and you drive to Nashville and you go to the federal building on Broadway and you walk in the front door and you ask for the Public Integrity Office. Not the FBI field office. Public integrity. You give them the documents and the drive and her testimony. He paused. You understand. Carver looked at him with the expression of a man who had understood from the beginning that this favor was larger than the ones that came before it and had showed up anyway. Yeah, he said. I got it. Priest turned back to the building. They went over the fence at the east corner at 4:27 in the morning, 6 men moving in the specific silence of men who had individually spent time in places where silence was a survival requirement and had never fully unlearned it. The temperature had dropped again, ice on the fence links. The cold storage facility breathed visible condensation from 2 rooftop vents. The loading dock service entrance had a keypad lock that Decker bypassed in 40 seconds with tools from a kit he kept inside his cut without anyone ever asking him why. The door swung open and warm air came out. Not room temperature warm, but above freezing warm, which the body after an hour in serious cold experienced as a shock. They moved inside. The interior of the building was not what Cade had built in his head during the approach. He'd built a utilitarian nightmare, something clinical and cold, and obviously wrong. What he found was a building organized to appear ordinary. A warehouse space on the left, shelving units, pallets, the infrastructure of a legitimate storage operation that would pass a casual inspection. A corridor through the middle of the building, fluorescent lights, office doors. The right side of the building separated by a wall with a single steel door at the far end, a keypad beside it, a surveillance camera above it positioned to see the corridor approach. The light from the second-floor window came from a staircase at the end of the corridor. The desk position Reuben had described was directly left of the main entrance, occupied by a man in civilian clothes who was currently looking at a bank of monitors and had a coffee mug in his hand and had not yet processed that the loading dock entrance indicator on his board had gone from green to yellow to back to green in a pattern that was almost but not quite the normal cycling pattern. Almost. Decker took the desk position silently before the man completed the double take he was beginning to perform. It was done without violence and without noise, and the man was zip-tied to his chair with his own belt and a section of electrical cable from the dock room in under 90 seconds. And throughout all of it, he said only 2 words, "Wait and please," which told Cade that the man was an employee of something rather than a true believer in it, which was useful information but didn't change anything operationally. "Cameras," Bones said. "Looping now," Decker said, already at the monitor panel. Priest looked at the steel door at the end of the corridor. He looked at Cade. Cade looked at the door and felt something he hadn't let himself feel during any of the preceding hours. The specific weight of 8 years condensing into a single point of arrival. The fire. Danny's grave. The investigation that closed in 6 weeks. Reuben's misdirections. The audio recording. How many? He walked to the door. The keypad. He looked at Reuben. Reuben said 6 digits from memory, without hesitation, in the voice of a man who had spent 3 years trying to forget a number and failed. Cade entered them. The light went green. The door opened. What was on the other side of the door hit him with the specific force of something you have understood intellectually, but not yet absorbed completely until the moment you are standing inside it. A long room, warm, lit with work lights on stands, with cots along both walls, with a corridor leading to a further room, with the evidence of people having been in this space recently in the form of clothing and blankets and food containers, and the smell of people in an enclosed space over time. Currently empty. Not abandoned. Occupied recently, within the last 24 hours, based on the temperature of a half-finished cup of something on a crate near the door. "They moved them," Hatcher said. "Tonight," Bones said. He was looking at the cots, at the specific imprints in the bedding. Within the last few hours, Cade stood in the middle of the room and breathed. Moved them. The network, already accelerating because Reuben went dark, had moved the people in this facility before the night was over, which meant they'd had warning, which meant the window hadn't just been hours. It had been less. "There's a log," Decker said. He'd found a clipboard near the door, a handwritten grid, dates and numbers, the kind of record a functioning operation maintained for internal coordination. He held it up. "Transfer manifest. Tonight's date." He looked at it. "They moved 21 people." 21. Hatcher put his hand against the wall and kept it there. "Destination," Priest said. Decker looked at the manifest. His jaw tightened. "Transit point. A number. Looks like a location code." He looked at Reuben. "You know what this refers to." Reuben took the clipboard. He looked at the number. Something moved through his face that had no name Cade could put to it. Not surprise? Not recognition, something older and more corrosive. He set the clipboard down. Freight yard, he said. Eastern edge of the county. Old CSX switching yard. Been decommissioned for 8 years. He looked up. It's a transit hub. They use it when they need to move people quickly. The rail infrastructure makes it easy to disperse in multiple directions simultaneously. If they're moving 21 people through a freight yard at, he looked at his watch, 4:45 in the morning. The trucks are already there or already gone, Bones said. Not trucks. Rubin's voice was flat. The manifest code means rail car. Decommissioned doesn't mean inactive. They maintain a private rail connection. Has to be a specific window for the connection to be available. He looked at the clipboard again. 6 a.m. 6 a.m. was 73 minutes away. Cade looked at Priest. Priest looked at the room full of empty cots. 21 people moved in the last 2 hours, sitting in a freight yard 6 miles away, waiting for a rail connection that would disperse them in multiple directions simultaneously and make them effectively impossible to find and impossible to link to any documented evidence. In 73 minutes. We can't reach that freight yard in time to do anything useful with what we have right now, Bones said. Not pessimistically, just as math. We have the manifest, Cade said. We have a handwritten clipboard that defense attorneys will eat for breakfast. We have the facility that they've emptied. We have the monitoring system and the desk position and a man zip-tied to a chair who works for these people and is currently deciding how afraid he is, Cade said. His voice had gone to that place again, the place with no temperature. We have Rubin's testimony. We have Jesse Vale's documents. We have the audio recording of my brother's voice in a conversation that happened 2 days before the fire that killed him. He paused. That's not nothing. That's enough to start something we can't finish if those 21 people go on that rail car. The fluorescent light in the corridor hummed. What are you saying? Priest said. Cade looked at him. I'm saying we go to the freight yard, Cade said. All of us. To do what, Cade? With 8 people and no heavy resources against a protected operation with federal coverage in a decommissioned freight yard at 5 in the morning. To be visible, Cade said. To be loud. To be the thing they cannot manage quietly. He looked at the room, at each of them, at the empty cots with their imprinted bedding. They have been very careful for 11 years to keep everything quiet. No noise, no exposure, nothing that brings cameras or attention. That's been their security model, invisibility. He paused. They cannot maintain that if we are physically present at that freight yard at 5 in the morning and we are not quiet. They'll kill us, Hatcher said. They'll try. Cade looked at him steadily. But killing 8 people at a freight yard at 5 in the morning is significantly noisier than making 2 mechanics disappear in a rural fire. Silence. Long silence. Priest's face worked through something. The full calculation, every angle, the cost and the benefit, and the specific point at which a man stopped calculating and started deciding based on who he was, rather than what the numbers said. Call Willa, Priest said to Decker. Decker got on the burner. Priest looked at Cade. We do this. There's no version of this that ends with us invisible. Whatever happens at that freight yard, this club is in it permanently. Our names, our faces, our involvement. I know. After tonight, we are not the same thing we were yesterday. I know that too. You're asking every man here to... I'm not asking anyone, Cade said. I'm going. Each of them decides for themselves. He looked at the room. Hatcher's jaw was hard and his eyes were bright with something that had passed through fear into the territory beyond it. He said nothing. He picked up his cut from where he'd set it against the wall and put it on. That was his answer. Decker put the phone down. Willa's in the truck with Carver. She says... He paused. She says she's not staying with the truck. Carver can't hold her, Garza said. First words he'd spoken in 2 hours. Carver cannot hold her, Decker confirmed. Cade was already moving toward the door. They came out of the facility into the freezing pre-dawn, and across the dark lot, Cade could see the shape of Carver's truck, and beside it, the smaller shape of a person who had gotten out of the vehicle and was standing in the cold with her backpack on and her jaw set, looking at them with the absolute inflexibility of someone who has made a final decision about what they are willing to accept. He walked to her. She met him in the middle of the lot. "Don't tell me to stay," she said. "I wasn't going to." Something shifted in her face. Not relief. Something older than relief. "They're at the freight yard," he said. 6 a.m. window. All 21. She absorbed that. "My dad's recording," she said. He said he was sorry he couldn't do more. She looked at him with the steady eyes that weren't fearless but were steady. "I want to be able to tell him, whatever comes after telling someone something, that someone did more." Cade looked at her for a moment. Then he turned toward the trucks. "Get in," he said. "We're going to need every minute." The engines turned over in the frozen dark, and from somewhere ahead of them, somewhere in the direction of the east where the sky was beginning its first gray suggestions of the coming day, came the distant sound of heavy machinery beginning to move, the low, grinding, industrial sound of a freight yard waking up. The rail connection was being prepared. 61 minutes. Cade pressed his foot against the floor of Carver's truck and felt the engine respond beneath him and pointed his eyes at the dark road ahead and did not look away from it because looking away was a luxury he no longer had. None of them did. And somewhere in the darkness to the south, somewhere behind them on a mountain road, somewhere in the county, somewhere in the network of federal communication channels that had protected this operation for 11 years, someone was already making a call, not to the freight yard, past it, to someone with the authority to ensure that whatever happened at that freight yard in the next 60 minutes was the last thing the Black Vulture's MC ever did. The trucks hit the county road and accelerated east into the dark, and the sky began, very slowly, to go gray. The freight yard materialized out of the gray pre-dawn, like something that had always existed at the edge of the world and simply waited for them to arrive. Carver killed the headlights a quarter-mile out, and they rolled the last stretch on engine noise alone, the two trucks moving slowly through the access road that ran alongside the old CSX fence line, chain link topped with barbed wire, sections sagging where the posts had rusted through at the base, the particular dilapidation of infrastructure that had been maintained just enough to function and no more. Beyond the fence, the switching yard spread out in the gray light, dead rails running in parallel lines across frozen gravel, signal towers dark, a row of freight containers along the far wall, and at the eastern end of the yard, under the loading gantry that still had its crane mechanism locked in operating position, 3 vehicles and a box truck and a rail car with its side door open and light spilling from inside it onto the frozen ground. Cade counted people near the rail car, 6 visible, armed, not obviously, but the way they stood and the way they faced outward said what their clothing concealed. Inside the rail car, movement. Multiple people, not guards. The movement was different, the particular confined shuffling of people in a space they hadn't chosen. 53 minutes had become 22 somewhere in the drive. They sat at the edge of the access road in the 2 dark trucks and breathed. 6 visible, Bones said. More inside the car and inside that box truck, Cade said. The truck's running, see the exhaust. Main gate is padlocked from the inside, Decker said. He was looking through a scope that lived in his cut and that nobody ever asked about. Single padlock, old hardware. 2 fence sections east of the gate have ground separation, Reuben said. He was in the back seat and his voice had the quality of someone spending their last useful currency. Flood damage last spring. The fence pulls away from the post at the base, wide enough. Priest was looking at the rail car. He was looking at the light coming out of it and the movement visible inside it, and he had the expression of a man who has spent a long time being one kind of person and is now in the process of becoming another kind without being entirely certain what the other kind looks like yet. We need noise, Cade said. We need to be visible and loud before they can manage a quiet response. The moment this becomes something that can't be contained locally, they call for the federal coverage, Bones said. And the federal coverage takes time to arrive. Time is the variable. Cade looked at the group. We give them a situation they cannot quietly resolve, and we keep it unresolved long enough for someone outside this county to see it. Who outside this county? Hatcher said. Willa said, Me. Everyone looked at her. She had her phone out. Not a burner, her actual phone, which had been off since the diner and which she'd turned on in the last 5 minutes of the drive. I have a contact, investigative journalist in Knoxville. I've been sitting on Jesse's documents for 8 months trying to figure out how to approach someone I could trust. I trust her. She looked at Cade. If I send her everything right now, the documents, the audio files, the location, she has enough to make calls before 6 a.m. Enough to make it loud before the federal coverage can put a lid on it. Sending from your phone identifies your location, Bones said. Good, Willa said. Let it. The silence that followed had a different texture than the silences before it. Not the silence of men calculating, but the silence of men who had just watched someone else decide something and were catching up to it. Cade looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Send it." She was already typing. But the fence section came away from the post with a sound like a slow exhale, the rusted base giving up its connection to the frozen ground with a particular reluctance that felt almost appropriate. Decker held it wide and they went through one at a time. Cade first, then Hatcher, then Garza and Torres and Decker himself, then Priest, and last Reuben Cross, who went through the fence without being asked and without being stopped, and took a position on Priest's left without any discussion about whether that was where he belonged. Bones stayed at the trucks with Willa and Carver. It wasn't discussed either. Bones was the one who understood what the documents were worth and how to hold them and what to say if someone arrived. He was also the one who, if it came to it, could put himself between a girl with evidence and whatever came for her with the particular effectiveness of a man who looked exactly like what he was. They moved across the switching yard in the gray dark with frozen gravel crunching under their boots. Unavoidable, sound carrying in the cold, and the men at the railcar heard them at 40 yards. The response was immediate and professional. 2 of the 6 visible guards moved toward them, and the other 4 repositioned, and a voice carried across the yard with the flat authority of a man who had done this before. "Stop where you are. Private property." They didn't stop. They kept walking, not running, the specific pace of men who had decided on an approach and were committed to it. "Stop now!" 20 yards, Priest said loudly enough to carry. "Those people in that rail car are going with us." The guard who'd spoken looked at the 7 men walking toward him in worn leather cuts in the gray pre-dawn of a decommissioned freight yard, and made the calculation that most people made when confronted with 7 men who moved the way these men moved and hadn't stopped when asked. He reached for his radio instead of his weapon, which was the smart call, which also told Cade that these men were employed by something rather than fully part of it. The instinct to call for support rather than escalate meant they understood their own limits. That bought 30 seconds. 30 seconds was what it took. What happened in those 30 seconds was not clean and not cinematic, and not the kind of thing that produced clear victors. It was 7 men and 6 guards in a freight yard, and everyone making rapid physical decisions in poor light on frozen ground. Cade took a hit to the left side of his ribs that he processed as information rather than pain and kept moving. Hatcher went down briefly on one knee and came back up with the controlled fury of a young man who had been running scared for 8 hours and had reached the far side of fear. Garza, who had said almost nothing for the entire night, turned out to be the most efficient person in the yard. Priest absorbed 2 men simultaneously with the calm methodology of someone who had done the math on his own size long ago and accepted the conclusions. Reuben Cross took a guard down from behind with a single movement, the economy of it suggesting a history nobody in the club had asked about. And when the guard was down, Reuben stood over him with his chest heaving and looked at Cade across the yard with an expression that was the most honest thing Cade had seen on his face since he came down the ladder. The radio call had gone out. They had however long it took for backup to arrive. Cade moved to the rail car. The door was already partly open, the light he'd seen from the fence. He pulled it fully open and stepped up onto the car's floor and stood in the entrance and looked at what was inside. 21 people. Sitting or standing in the long car, dressed in a combination of their own clothing and what had clearly been provided to them. Thin blankets, ill-fitting shoes, ages ranging from a teenager who couldn't have been more than 15 to a woman who appeared to be in her 60s. Multiple nationalities. Most of them looking at him with the specific expression of people who have learned that the arrival of new people in their space was not historically a good development, and were calculating whether this was different. He stood in the door of the rail car and said, in the steadiest voice he could find, "The people who brought you here are down. We're getting you out of this yard. He paused. Nobody here is going to hurt you. Silence. Then the teenager, a girl, 15 or 16, wearing a jacket 2 sizes too large, said in accented English, "How we know?" Cade looked at her. "You don't," he said honestly, "but the door's open and you can see the yard and you can make your own decision about what you see." She looked past him at the yard, at 7 men in leather cuts standing in a decommissioned freight yard in the gray dawn, several of them bleeding, all of them waiting. She got up. The others followed. The calls started arriving before all 21 people were out of the rail car. Willa's journalist contact had been awake. It turned out that a contact you'd been carefully cultivating for 8 months tended to respond to a message time-stamped 5:09 a.m., containing audio files of a dead man's voice documenting a trafficking network and coordinates of an active facility. She had made 4 calls in 11 minutes. 2 of those calls reached people who made further calls. By 5:37, there were 2 county sheriff's vehicles on the main road outside the freight yard, not Hargrove's department, the adjacent county, responding to a welfare call that had been routed through channels that bypassed the normal local dispatch. By 5:52, a federal vehicle arrived, not the kind Cade had been afraid of, not the covered, unmarked, deniable kind, the visible kind, with proper credentials and a woman in a suit who had a recorder running before she stepped out of the car, which meant she'd been briefed and was making a record from the moment of arrival, which meant someone in an oversight capacity had received something they couldn't ignore. Cade learned later that Willa's journalist had sent the audio file, specifically the recording of Danny's voice asking how many 2 days before his death, to 3 separate editors simultaneously. The arithmetic of that made suppression expensive enough to be non-viable. It wasn't a clean ending. Endings like this were never clean. The federal coverage Rubin had described didn't evaporate because 7 bikers showed up at a freight yard. It scrambled, repositioned, began the long process of deciding which parts of the network could be sacrificed to protect the higher levels. That process would take months. Some of the names on Bones's list would have lawyers and oversight protection that made prosecution a years-long effort. Some of the people who deserved to sit in a room and answer for 11 years of decisions would sit in that room and others would not. But 21 people got out of a rail car in the gray pre-dawn of an eastern Tennessee freight yard. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the specific thing 2 men had died trying to make happen. Hargrove was arrested at 7:15 the same morning at his home in Bledsoe County, still in his bathrobe. The official record of his arrest noted that he was cooperative. People who knew him said later that he looked like a man who had been expecting a knock on his door for a long time and had finally stopped dreading it. The facility in Crossroads Township was secured by 9 a.m. The desk employee who'd been zip-tied to his chair had by that point been talking to investigators for 2 hours and had demonstrated the particular loquacity of a man who understood that the architecture of the operation he'd been employed by was collapsing and that the question was not whether but which floor he landed on. The state-level official whose name had produced a silence around the cabin table resigned his position at 11 a.m., citing personal reasons. The resignation was accepted. What followed was a federal process that moved at the pace federal processes moved, which was slow and grinding and impersonal, and Cade understood that watching it was going to be its own particular form of endurance. But it moved. That was the thing that had never happened before. It moved. The Black Vultures were held for questioning for 11 hours. Not arrested, questioned, in the conference room of the adjacent county sheriff's department, with access to phones and with the woman in the suit present, which kept the process in a register that felt like it might stay there. Priest answered questions with the precise economy of a man who had prepared for this eventuality in the abstract and was now performing the preparation without flourish. Bones provided documentation. Reuben Cross gave a statement that lasted 4 hours and covered 8 years, in which he delivered with the flat thoroughness of a man emptying a room of everything it contained, leaving nothing in the corners. Cade sat in a chair with his left side aching from the freight yard. 2 cracked ribs, a field diagnosis he confirmed by breathing too deeply and feeling what happened, and answered the questions put to him and volunteered nothing beyond what was asked. And when he was finally left alone for 20 minutes while investigators conferred, he sat with his hands on the table and looked at them. Old hands, scarred in specific places, a hand that had held a rifle and a wrench and a coffee cup, and for a few hours, a folded piece of notebook paper with his dead brother's motorcycle design on it. He thought about Danny, not the grief shape of Danny he'd been carrying, the frozen version, the young version, the one that lived at the moment of loss and never aged. He thought about the Danny in the recording, the older voice, the one that had sat in a truck with Jesse Vale and asked how many with the specific gravity of a man who already knew the answer was going to require something from him. Danny had known. He'd gone toward it anyway. Cade sat with that for a long time. They released them at 6 in the evening. The sky had done a full rotation by then, from gray pre-dawn to cold winter sun to the early dark that eastern Tennessee did in February. The way the light just let go without much ceremony around 4:30 and didn't come back until it was ready. Cade walked out of the sheriff's department into the parking lot and stood in the cold air and breathed. The others came out in ones and twos. Nobody spoke immediately. There was a particular exhaustion that went past words, the exhaustion of people who had been awake for 36 hours and had spent most of those hours at the edge of things that mattered, and who were now standing in an ordinary parking lot under ordinary fluorescent lights and feeling the specific disorientation of the ordinary world reasserting itself. Willa came out last. She'd been in a different room with different investigators for most of the day, her chain of custody to Jesse's evidence making her testimony its own thread that required its own handling. She came out of the building door and stood at the top of the 2 steps and looked at the parking lot and at the 7 men standing in it. She had a paper coffee cup in her hand. Investigator had given it to her at some point in the afternoon. She'd carried it empty for hours without putting it down, the way people held on to small, ordinary objects when the larger things were beyond holding. She walked down the steps. She stood in front of Cade. She looked at him for a moment with the steady eyes he'd seen in the diner, in the forest, in the freight yard, the eyes that weren't fearless but were steady, and she said, "Is it done?" He thought about that honestly. "Enough of it," he said. She considered that. "Okay," she said. It was the 3rd time she'd said that word to him, and each time it had meant something different. This one meant something he didn't have another word for. Not closure, not relief, not peace. Something rawer than peace. Something that was what peace looked like before it had learned to look like peace. She looked at the other men, at Hatcher, who had a bandage above his left eye from the freight yard and was standing with his hands in his cut pockets, looking at the ground with the expression of a young man who has passed through something and come out the other side and is still figuring out who he is over there. At Decker, who was looking at his phone with the blank expression of a man who has been away from normal life for too long and finds it slightly unrecognizable. At Bones, who was looking at her with the particular quiet attention that was his resting mode and had been, she now understood, looking out for her since the first moment she walked into the garage. At Garza and Torres, who stood slightly apart with the particular self-containment of men who contributed what was needed and required nothing in return. At Reuben Cross, who was standing at the very edge of the group with the posture of a man who doesn't know if he's in the picture or outside it. She looked at Priest, who was looking at her with an expression she read correctly as something rare from that man, a kind of uncomplicated warmth that had nothing strategic in it. She turned back to Cade. "What happens now?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "Testimony, process. A long time of watching lawyers argue about things that should be simple. For you. For all of us, probably. I don't have anywhere to go," she said. Not plaintively, just as fact. "The diner is, don't go back to the diner." "I know." She looked at the paper cup in her hands. "I know that." Cade looked at her for a moment, then he looked at Priest. Priest made a small movement with his head, barely perceptible, just a slight tilt that meant whatever it meant to the two of them, in the language they'd developed over years of not saying things out loud that didn't need to be said out loud. "There's a garage," Cade said. "In Harlan Falls." Willa looked at him. "It's going to need work," he said, "after last night." "I don't know anything about garages." "You know about murals," he said. "The walls are blank." She looked at him for a long time. Something moved through her face. The full weight of 8 months of sleeping in a diner town trying to stay invisible. 8 years before that of being a child, the system moved through its processing without seeing. 8 years before that of being a mechanic's daughter who grew up around engines and sketches, and a father who was, in the end, a man who couldn't look away from something wrong and didn't try to. The paper cup in her hand finally gave up the last warmth it had been holding. "Okay," she said. Fourth time. This one meant something else again. They found the bikes where Carver had managed to get them trailered and relocated during the hours of the questioning, which was a debt Priest would be paying in various forms for the foreseeable future and didn't seem to mind. The Harleys were in a lot behind a tire shop 3 miles from the sheriff's department, lined up in their row, waiting, the way they always waited, with the indifferent patience of machines that only became something when the people who understood them got on them. Cade stood beside his for a moment before mounting. He reached into his cut. The drawing was still there. It had been there through the creek and the forest and the freight yard and 11 hours of questioning pressed against his chest, a piece of notebook paper that had survived a diner counter and a storage unit, and 8 years of a girl carrying it because it was the last thing her father touched. He unfolded it. In the parking lot light, Danny's pencil lines were exactly what they'd always been. A motorcycle that had never been built, detailed and precise, with the particular care of a man who understood that some things were worth getting exactly right. The annotations in Jesse's hand in the margins, the numbers that weren't measurements. He stood with it for a while. Then he folded it back along its creases and put it back in his cut, not because he couldn't let go, because it was exactly where it belonged. Willa was already on the back of his bike. She'd gotten on without being asked, which was its own statement. Her arms went around his waist, not tentatively, not the first night's desperate grip in the rain, but with the settled surety of someone who had decided where she was and had stopped being uncertain about the decision. The engines started one at a time down the line. The sound built the way it always built. Not all at once, but in sequence, each engine finding the note it lived at, the collective sound becoming something larger than the sum of its parts, the particular resonance of Harley engines in cold air that Cade had felt in his chest since he was 22 years old, and that still, after all these years and all these miles and all these things the road had cost him, felt like the closest thing to a true language he'd ever found. He sat for a moment with the engine running beneath him, and the cold air on his face, and Willa's arms around his waist, and his brother's drawing against his chest. He thought of Danny at 19, sitting at the kitchen table in Murfreesboro, with his pencils laid out, filling graph paper notebooks with designs that were mostly dreams. He thought of Jesse Vale in a truck in the dark, talking into a phone, trying to leave something behind that mattered. He thought of 21 people in a rail car who had gotten out of that car in the gray dawn of an eastern Tennessee freight yard because 2 men who died 8 years apart had refused to look away. He thought, it took long enough. He thought, but it counts. Then he pulled out of the lot. They stopped at a diner. It wasn't planned. It was simply the first open place they passed, 20 miles north of the sheriff's department, at the edge of a small town that was still mostly asleep in the February pre-dawn. A 24-hour diner with a parking lot big enough to hold 17 bikes and a lit sign that said "Open" in red and a window through which the warm amber light of a functioning kitchen was visible from the road. They filled the place the way they always filled places, all at once, all the space, the atmosphere adjusting around them. The waitress on the overnight shift was a woman in her 40s who looked at 17 men in wet leather and 1 young woman and made the same calculation the woman in the Tennessee mountains had made months ago, which was that the coffee was on and the kitchen was running and she'd ask them to leave if they gave her a reason, and they probably wouldn't. They sat in booths and at the counter. Nobody spoke much. The coffee came and the food came, and the particular quiet of very tired people eating without ceremony settled over the place. Hatcher ate with his elbows on the table and his eyes half closed. Decker wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and stared into the middle distance. Garza and Torres talked in low Spanish about something domestic and ordinary. Bones wrote something in his small notebook. Not case information, not coordinates or names. Something else. He closed the notebook before Cade could see what. Reuben Cross sat at the end of the counter alone. He ate his eggs slowly. He didn't look at anyone. He had the particular containment of a man in the process of deciding what he was. Not what he'd been, and not what he might become, but what he was right now, in this diner, on this morning, with this specific weight on him. Cade took the stool beside him. Reuben looked up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I can't fix it," Reuben said. "No. What I didn't do, there's no—" He stopped. "I know there's no version of saying sorry that covers it." "No," Cade said. Reuben looked at his plate. "I'll testify to everything, whatever they need, for as long as it takes." "Yeah, you will." After that, Cade said. "I don't know." He picked up his coffee. "But after that is after that. Right now you're here and you crossed that fence with us and you gave us the code to that door." He looked at the counter. "That doesn't zero the account, but it's something on it." Reuben was quiet for a moment. "Your brother," he said. Danny was a good man." "Yeah." "The kind of good that costs you." "Yeah." Cade drank his coffee. "Jesse too, sounds like." "Both of them." Reuben's voice had gone somewhere that was past the need to perform anything, just the bare wire of it. "Both of them deserved better than what they got." "Most people do," Cade said. He moved back to his booth. Willow was sitting across from Priest. They were talking, Maso, genuinely talking, not the careful exchange of people who don't know each other yet, but the more direct conversation of two people who had been through something together and had arrived at a post-event honesty that couldn't have existed before it. Priest was explaining something about the garage, the legal structure of the building, the way the chapter operated. Willow was listening with her head slightly tilted and her coffee cup between both hands, and the occasional question that was specific and direct, the kind of question that told you the person asking had been paying attention and processing and not just waiting for their turn. She caught Cade's eye when he slid back into the booth. She raised her cup slightly. Not a toast, not a gesture with any established meaning, just the small acknowledgement between two people of shared context. He raised his. Outside, through the diner window, the sky was doing something. It was subtle. The absolute dark of 5 in the morning had shifted to the deep blue-gray of approaching dawn, the particular quality of light that preceded the actual light, the way darkness admitted it was ending before it ended. The parking lot was visible now, where it hadn't been 20 minutes ago. The Harleys in their row were visible. The road running north was visible, empty, the first suggestion of perspective returning to the world as the black became blue, became the early gray of an ordinary morning. Cade sat in a booth in a 24-hour diner in February with cracked ribs and 36 hours of no sleep, and his brothers drawing against his chest, and his coffee going cold in front of him. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not happy, not healed, nothing that clean, but lighter. The specific lightness of a thing set down. He had carried Danny's unfinished business for 8 years in the particular way guilty people carried things. Not in their hands where they could examine it, but in their chest where it pressed against the breathing and became part of the ordinary weight of being awake. It had become, over time, just the climate he lived in. The way certain veterans carried the weight of certain places, not because they chose to, but because they didn't know how to put it down without permission, and the permission never came from anywhere they could reach. He didn't have neat closure. He had never expected it. The people who deserved consequences were in the beginning of a long process that would grind forward regardless of how he felt about its pace. The network they'd been part of dismantling would leave roots, and those roots would require years to follow, and some of them would escape the following entirely. The 21 people from the rail car were somewhere tonight with people from a federal victim services unit beginning their own processes, which would be long and uncertain, and in several cases probably involved the specific cruelty of bureaucracy applied to people who needed simplicity. None of it was tied with a bow. But 2 men had tried to shine a light on something and had been killed for it, and the light had finally come on anyway, and the thing that had lived in the dark for 11 years was visible now, and people were moving toward it with cameras and recorders and documented authority. Danny had asked how many. Now there was an answer on record. That was what his brother had died trying to make happen. It had happened. Cade picked up his coffee cup and drank it cold and didn't put it down again until it was empty. They rode out of the diner parking lot at 6:52 in the morning. The sun was up, barely. The flat winter sun of February that came in low and without much warmth, but came nevertheless, the light touching the frost on the parking lot asphalt and making it briefly luminous before the temperature decided whether to hold or release. The Harleys started in their sequence, the sound building and settling into the collective note, exhaust visible in the cold air. Willa was on the back of Cade's bike. She had her arms around his waist and her chin tilted up and her eyes open, watching the town come past them as they pulled onto the road, the closed storefronts and the bare trees and the early pickup trucks that moved through the streets of small American towns at 7 in the morning because the people who lived in small American towns got up early and had work that didn't wait for a decent hour. Ordinary life. The texture of it. The specific weight of its ordinariness, which she had been outside of for so long that its proximity felt almost unfamiliar. Like standing near something warm after a long cold and not quite believing the warmth was real yet. Cade felt her arms around his waist and felt the engine beneath him and watched the road open up ahead as they cleared the town and hit the state route that ran north through the mountains, and he thought, not for the first time, but for the first time in a way that felt like arrival rather than question, that Danny had always been the better of the two of them. Smarter, quieter, braver in the specific way that cost everything. He had not been there when Danny needed him. He had been there when Jesse Vale's daughter needed him. He didn't know if that balanced anything. He suspected it didn't, not in any accounting that required precision. But he had stopped thinking about his life in terms of what balanced and what didn't a long time ago, somewhere between the Marines and the road and all the miles between, and what remained when you stopped looking for balance was just the next right thing, and the next after that. And the willingness to not look away when looking away was the easier option. Danny had understood that. In the end, Cade understood it too. The road ran north through the mountains and the winter light came in low and cold, and the engines ran their steady note, and somewhere behind him, 16 bikers rode in formation with the particular quality of men who had been through something together that they would never fully explain to anyone who wasn't there. And ahead of them, the garage waited in Harlan Falls with its empty walls and its wood stove and its particular smell of gasoline and coffee and old wood and the lives of imperfect men who kept showing up for each other anyway. Willa tightened her arms slightly around his waist. Not from fear, just from the particular grip of a person who has finally found a direction worth moving in and is holding on, not desperately, but solidly, the way you held on to things that were real. He opened the throttle. The mountains received them. The road went on. Outlaws weren't always monsters. Sometimes they were the only thing standing between the innocent and the dark. And sometimes, if they were very lucky, the dark gave something back. That's the full story of Cade Mercer, Willa Vale, and the Black Vultures MC. If this hit you somewhere real, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me which moment got you. And if you stayed all the way to the end of this one, you already know what kind of person you are. Ride safe.